Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend MHA What If with another fanfiction. This is first part of What If Deku's quirk shattered the balance of society? All credits for this video go to the original author, RN117. So, please support the real author by checking out the link in the description for more details. If you want more videos like this, give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get into the fanfic. The quirk singularity theory, first proposed by Dr. Kyudai Garaki, suggests that over time, the incredible powers we call quirks will become so powerful and complex through genetic inheritance that they'll eventually become uncontrollable, leading to the collapse of human society. Of course, the theory was quickly dismissed as fearmongering. That began to change when Izuku Midoriya's quirk first manifested. As the sun met the earth. XXX. Inko Midoriya was worried, though that word felt too small for the cold knot twisting in her chest. Her little boy had come home sobbing, his breath hitching in sharp, uneven gasps that made her heart clench. Scrapes and burns marked his knees and elbows, bruises already blooming purple along his small arms. His tiny hands trembled as he clutched the torn strap of his favorite All Might backpack. The fabric was singed at the edges, the cheerful red and blue now marred with black scorch marks. It had taken her nearly an hour to coax the story out of him. She'd held him on the couch, stroking his hair, murmuring soft reassurances while he buried his face against her shoulder. His small body had shaken with each sob. When he finally spoke, his voice was so small she had to lean close to hear, and when she did get the story out of him, it nearly broke her heart. Her little hero had tried to stop Katsuki and his friends from bullying a boy in their class. She couldn't remember his name. Tsubasa, maybe? Or was that one of Katsuki's friends? It didn't matter. The boy had manifested a quirk that let him stretch his cheeks out like a frog. The other children had laughed. They'd poked at him, made rib-biting sounds, called him gross. And of course, Katsuki had called it useless, and that had been enough to turn the whole playground against the poor boy. And of course, Izuku had stepped between them to put a stop to it. She loved her son's heroic heart with every fiber of her being. That instinct to protect, to stand up for the weak even when he was the smallest one there. It was appealing. It was everything she tried to teach him. But sometimes she wished he would at least wait for his quirk. She knew he was a late bloomer. The doctor had said as much during their last visit, speaking in that careful, measured tone that was meant to be reassuring but only made her more anxious. Some children don't manifest until 5 or even 6, he'd said. There's still time. But Izuku was the last in his class. Every week, it seemed, another child came to school bursting with excitement over their new ability. Wings. Stretchy limbs. The power to make small objects float. And every week, Izuku came home a little quieter, his smile a little more forced. Perhaps she should go ahead and schedule another doctor's appointment. Just to be sure. The doctor had told her last time that all the signs were there. Even pointing out the missing joint in her son's pinky toe on his X-ray. But still it was taking so long. She shook her head, shoulders slumping as she let out a long, weary breath. That Bakugo boy again. She pressed her palm against her temple, fighting down the old, familiar frustration. Mitsuki was her friend and had been since before either of their sons were born. They'd met at a prenatal class, bonded over swollen ankles and bizarre cravings, promised each other their children would grow up as close as siblings. But lately, every conversation about Katsuki felt like walking on eggshells scattered over a minefield. That boy's quirk had gone straight to his head. The praise, the attention, the way adults fawned over those flashy little explosions. Teachers called him gifted. Neighbors said he'd be a great hero someday. Even strangers on the street stopped to compliment Mitsuki on her son's amazing talent. It had fed something ugly in him, something that grew a little bigger every month, and if she was being truthful, it had fed something in her friend as well. Although strong quirks and inflated egos always seem to go hand in hand these days, but Katsuki was only 4 years old. He shouldn't already look at other children like they were beneath him. Mitsuki needs to do something, Inko thought, not for the first time. Before that temper gets someone seriously hurt. She pushed those thoughts aside. There would be time for that difficult conversation later. She'd call Mitsuki tomorrow, maybe. Or the day after. When she'd found the right words. When she'd figured out how to say, "Your son is becoming a bully and it's your fault," without destroying a friendship that had lasted nearly a decade. For now, her son needed her. Inko crept down the hallway. Her socks glided silently against the wooden floor. The apartment was quiet, filled only with the distant hum of the refrigerator and the soft murmur of sound leaking from Izuku's room. A thin line of light glowed beneath his door, flickering slightly with the movement of images on his laptop screen. She eased the door open, just a crack, and peeked inside. Izuku was sprawled across his bed, sound asleep. His cheeks were still blotchy from crying. Tear tracks had dried on his skin like tiny rivers carved through dust. One arm dangled off the mattress, fingers brushing the carpet. His other hand clutched a small All Might plush, its worn fabric testament to years of love and countless nights spent as a comfort against bad dreams. On the nightstand, his little laptop played the same All Might video on an endless loop. The one from the Kamino rescue 3 years ago, when the symbol of peace had pulled 47 people from a collapsed building in under 10 minutes. Izuku had watched it so many times that the audio was probably burned into his dreams. He could recite every word, every triumphant declaration, every reassurance that help had arrived. "Fear not, citizens." All Might's voice boomed from the tiny speakers, bright and impossibly confident. "For I am here." The hero's laughter filled the room like a comforting blanket. Inko smiled faintly, warmth flickering through her worry. Even on his worst days, All Might could make her son believe in heroes again. Could make him believe that goodness won, that the strong protected the weak, that standing up for others was never wrong even when it hurt. She stepped inside, careful to avoid the scattered action figures on the floor. Present Mike midshout. Eraserhead with his capture weapon trailing across the carpet. A limited edition 13 that Izuku had saved his allowance for months to buy. She navigated the minefield of plastic heroes and reached for the laptop to mute the sound. But as she moved toward the door, something made her pause. The air seemed to be warmer. It was subtle at first. The kind of warmth you might feel standing near a sunlit window on a spring afternoon, pleasant and easy to dismiss. Inko frowned, pausing in the doorway. She could have sworn the temperature had been fine just 20 minutes ago when she'd tucked him in. The evening had been cool, even a little chilly. She'd pulled his blanket up to his chin and kissed his forehead, and his skin had felt perfectly normal beneath her lips. Now the room felt like midsummer. She stepped into the hall and padded toward the thermostat mounted on the wall near the kitchen. The little digital display glowed a steady green, 21°C. Exactly where she'd set it that morning. The same as always. She tapped the screen, wondering if it was malfunctioning, but the numbers held steady. No error codes. No warning lights. According to the thermostat, everything was perfectly fine. Maybe the building's heating system is acting up again, she thought, though the explanation felt hollow even as it formed. Their apartment was on the 3rd floor, sandwiched between the Takahashis above and old Mrs. Yamamoto below. Both households complained about drafts more often than stuffiness. Mr. Takahashi had knocked on her door just last week to ask if her heating was working properly because his apartment felt like an icebox. If anything, their unit usually ran a little cool this time of year. She pressed her palm flat against the hallway wall. Cool plaster. Normal. Maybe she was imagining things. Stress could do that, couldn't it? She'd spent the last hour holding her sobbing child, her heart breaking with every hitched breath, her mind churning through a dozen different ways to handle the Bakugo situation. Perhaps her body was just running hot from the emotional strain. She returned to Izuku's room. The warmth had grown. It pressed against her skin the moment she crossed the threshold, thick and heavy, like stepping into a room where someone had left an oven door hanging open for hours. The difference was stark enough to make her breath catch. This wasn't her imagination. This wasn't stress. In the span of 30 seconds, the temperature had climbed noticeably higher. Inko's frown deepened into genuine concern. She glanced around the small bedroom, searching for a source. A forgotten space heater shoved under the bed. His laptop overheating from hours of continuous play. A heating pad left on by accident. Anything that might explain why his room felt like a sauna while the rest of the apartment remained cool. There was nothing. Just her son, still sleeping peacefully on his bed. Just the action figures scattered across the floor, the posters on the walls, the soft glow of the laptop screen where All Might's frozen smile waited for the video to loop again. Worry began to take root in her chest, twining around that familiar cold knot and pulling it tighter. She crossed the floor toward him, intending to scoop Izuku up and carry him to the couch while she figured out what was happening. Maybe a pipe had burst somewhere in the building and was venting hot steam through the walls? Maybe there was an electrical fire smoldering behind the drywall, hidden but growing? She needed to get Izuku somewhere safe and then call the superintendent, or the fire department, or someone who could tell her why her son's bedroom had become a furnace. She reached for him. And stopped. Her hands hovered in the air, inches from his small body. Close enough to feel it. He was burning up. Not the flush of a childhood fever. Not the warmth of too many blankets piled on a cool night. Heat radiated off him in waves, rippling through the air like the shimmer above summer pavement. She could feel it against her palms without even touching him. It pushed back against her skin like an invisible barrier, warm, insistent, and utterly impossible. "Izuku," she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. He didn't stir. His chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm, slow and peaceful. His face was soft with sleep, his lips slightly parted, his brow smooth and untroubled. He looked exactly like he always did when he slept. Like a perfectly normal 4-year-old boy dreaming perfectly normal dreams. Except for the heat. She inched her hand closer, fighting against the warmth pressing back at her. Her fingertips came within a centimeter of his forehead and she had to pull back. It was too hot. Not painful, not yet, but intense enough to make her skin prickle with warning. Is he sick? The thought flickered through her mind, desperate and irrational. A fever. It has to be a fever. Children get fevers all the time. High fevers. Dangerous fevers. I need to get him into a cool bath and call the doctor and... No fever could do this. No illness, no matter how severe, could heat an entire room in minutes. No childhood sickness could make the air warp and shimmer like a mirage over hot asphalt. She'd nursed Izuku through every cold, every flu, every bout of stomach bug that swept through his preschool class. She knew what a sick child felt like. This wasn't sickness. This was something else entirely. Her mind raced through the possibilities, discarding each one as quickly as it formed. A prank? Impossible. Some kind of external quirk affecting him? From who? There was no one else here. A bizarre medical condition she'd never heard of? Nothing in any parenting book or medical website had ever mentioned anything like this. Unless... His quirk, she breathed. The words escaped before she could stop them, barely louder than a whisper. She clamped both hands over her mouth, terrified the sound might wake him, might startle him, might somehow make whatever was happening worse. But Izuku didn't stir. His breathing remained slow and even, his expression soft with dreams. Perhaps he was dreaming of heroes. Perhaps he was dreaming of All Might, swooping in to save the day with that brilliant smile and those reassuring words. For one shining moment, Inko's heart soared. Finally, her baby boy had a quirk. After all those appointments in sterile offices with doctors who peered at charts and frowned at test results. After all those examinations where Izuku sat on cold tables in paper gowns, trying so hard to be brave while strangers poked and prodded and measured. After all those pitying looks from medical professionals who spoke in careful tones about late manifestation and genetic variability and statistical outliers. After watching him come home week after week with that smile growing more brittle, more forced, because the other children had started to whisper behind his back. After holding him while he cried because Katsuki, his oldest friend, his first friend, had started calling him Deku. Useless Deku. Quirkless Deku. Why do you even try? And now, finally, after all of that, he had a quirk. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. Happy tears. Relieved tears. She wanted to wake him up right now, this very instant, to shake him gently by the shoulder and tell him the wonderful news. She wanted to see his face light up the way it did whenever All Might appeared on screen, that pure and radiant joy that made everything else fade away. She wanted to call the doctor first thing in the morning and schedule an appointment to have it officially registered. She wanted to call Mitsuki and say, in the most casual voice she could manage, "Oh, by the way, Izuku's quirk finally came in." She wanted to tell everyone she knew. Her son was not broken. Had never been broken. He had just been waiting for the right moment to bloom. Her joy lasted exactly one heartbeat. The temperature spiked. Sweat beaded along her hairline, rolling down her temples in thin streams. The air grew thick, almost soupy, each breath coming warm and dry against the back of her throat. She could feel it now. Truly feel it. The heat wasn't just radiating from Izuku anymore. It was building, growing, climbing higher with every passing second like a fire being fed fresh fuel. On the walls, his posters began to curl at the edges. The All Might faces, once bright and triumphant, warped slowly as the adhesive beneath them softened and let go. One corner peeled free with a soft crackle, drooping toward the floor like a wilting flower. The colors seemed to fade slightly, bleached by the intensity of the warmth. Fear crashed back in. It came like a wave, cold and heavy, drowning that brief spark of joy beneath its weight. Her hands trembled at her sides. Her breath came faster, shallower, each inhale burning just a little more than the last. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. Inko spun on her heel and ran. The hallway felt blessedly cool after the stifling heat of Izuku's room, but she barely noticed. Her mind was racing, thoughts tumbling over each other in a cascade of panic and half-formed plans. She needed to do something. She needed to help him. She needed to get this under control before. Before what? Before he burned the building down? Before he hurt himself? Before whatever was happening inside him grew beyond anyone's ability to stop. The hall closet was 3 steps away. She covered the distance in 2, her fingers fumbling with the handle before she wrenched it open. Inside, shoved behind winter coats and boxes of old photographs, sat a large plastic container coated in years of dust. She hadn't touched it since the day she'd packed it away. Hadn't even looked at it. Dragging it out now, her arms strained against the weight, as she popped the lid with trembling hands. Firefighting tools. Heat-resistant gloves rated for industrial furnaces. Emergency cooling packs that activated on contact. Flame-retardant blankets woven from some space-age polymer she couldn't pronounce. A compact fire extinguisher, red and gleaming. A first-aid kit designed specifically for burn treatment. Inko had bought all of it 4 years ago, back when she was still P-Arginine and terrified of what her child might inherit. Isashi's quirk that let him breathe fire. Not powerfully, just enough to light small candles or warm his coffee when it went cold. A parlor trick, really. Nothing dangerous. But the doctors had warned her that quirks often intensified across generations. That their son might manifest something stronger. She'd read stories online about children with fire quirks who had accidentally set their cribs ablaze, who had burned down nurseries before they were old enough to walk. The thought had kept her up at night for months. So she'd prepared. She'd spent weeks researching, ordering specialized equipment, reading forums where parents of fire quirk children shared horror stories and hard-won advice. She'd assembled this kit piece by piece, checking and double-checking that she had everything she might possibly need. Hisashi had laughed at her, called her paranoid, told her she was worrying over nothing, that their son would probably just inherit her telekinesis or some harmless combination of both their quirks. "You're going to smother the kid before he's even born," he'd said, shaking his head with that dismissive smile she'd grown to hate. Then he'd left. Moved abroad for work, he said. A job opportunity too good to pass up. He'd be back soon. The calls would come. Regularly. He'd promised. The calls grew shorter. The visits never materialized, and Inko had shoved the box into the closet and tried to forget it existed. Tried to forget a lot of things, really. Now, pulling out the gloves with shaking hands, she thanked every anxious impulse she'd ever had. Just as a wave of heat slammed into her back. Inko gasped, stumbling forward against the closet door. Even through the walls, even from down the hall with the door closed, she could feel it. A surge of warmth so intense it made her skin prickle and tighten. The air itself seemed to flinch away from Izuku's room. It's getting worse. Her fingers scrambled for her phone, nearly dropping it twice before she managed to pull up the keypad. The numbers came through panic-blurred memory. Not 110 for police. Not 119 for fire and ambulance. A different number. One she'd memorized years ago during those sleepless PRGNT nights and never expected to use. 987. The Quirk emergency line. It connected after a single ring. Hello, this is the Quirk emergency line. Please state your name and the nature of your situation. The operator's voice was calm, measured. The practiced steadiness of someone trained to handle exactly this kind of call. I'm Inko Midoriya. Her voice came out high and thin, barely recognizable as her own. My son needs help. His quirk is manifesting and it's out of control. I'm afraid he's going to hurt himself, or burn the whole building down, or... She trailed off, not knowing how to finish the sentence. Or what came after that? Understood, ma'am. I'm dispatching a response team to your location now. The sound of rapid typing filled the brief pause. Can you tell me anything about the nature of your son's quirk? Nothing. This is the first time he's ever shown any signs. He's 4 years old. But... She pressed her free hand against her forehead, trying to force her thoughts into order. His body is giving off heat. Way too much of it. I could feel it through the walls just now. It's getting stronger every second. Thank you for that information, Mrs. Midoriya. Our team includes thermal specialists and quirk suppression personnel. They'll be equipped to handle the situation. Another pause. More typing. Estimated arrival time is approximately 3 minutes. Would you like me to stay on the line until they arrive? 3 minutes. It felt like an eternity. It felt like no time at all. She thought of the posters curling on Izuku's walls, the heat building and building, and wondered if 3 minutes would be too late. No, she said, forcing steel into her voice. No, that's fine. I'm going to try to lower his temperature. I have equipment. I prepared for this. Understood, ma'am. Please be careful. We don't want you getting hurt as well. I know. I will. But please hurry. The line clicked off. Inko set the phone down on the hallway table. Drew a long, shaking breath that did nothing to calm the pounding of her heart. Pulled on the heat-resistant gloves, flexing her fingers to test the fit. Grabbed a cooling pack in one hand and tucked a flame-retardant blanket under her arm. Her body was trembling. She could feel it in her hands, her knees, the rapid flutter of her pulse against her throat. But she was a mother, and panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. 3 minutes, she told herself. You just have to keep him safe for 3 minutes. You can do this. You have to do this. There's no one else. She walked back down the hallway. Each step felt like moving through syrup, slow and heavy with dread. The air grew warmer as she approached, pressing against her skin like a living thing. By the time she reached his door, sweat was already beading on her forehead despite the protective gear. She could see light now, spilling out from the crack beneath the door. A soft, golden glow that pulsed like a heartbeat. Inko placed her gloved hand on the doorknob. The metal was hot even through the insulated fabric. She turned it and pushed the door open. A wave of heat hit her like a physical blow. Inko staggered backward, her arm flying up to shield her face. The air in the room had transformed into something almost solid, thick and shimmering, rippling between her and her son like the surface of water about to boil. Each breath seared her lungs, hot and dry and tasting faintly of copper. Izuku, she called out, her voice thin and ragged. Izuku, baby, can you hear me? No response. Through the distortion, she could just barely make him out. Still lying on his side, still small and motionless. The bedding beneath him had begun to smoke. Thin wisps of gray curled up, rising toward the ceiling like the ghosts of prayers. And then she saw it. A light pulsed through his all-might onesie, centered directly over his chest. It was growing brighter by the second. Not a soft glow but something fierce and alive, beating in a slow, steady rhythm that seemed to sync with his breathing. Each pulse sent a fresh wave of heat rolling through the room, pushing against her, warning her back. But she didn't stop. She took a step forward. The heat pushed back, fierce and insistent. The cooling pack in her hand was already warming, the chemical reaction inside struggling uselessly against the impossible temperature. She could feel the blanket growing hot against her arm, the gloves beginning to lose their effectiveness. None of it mattered. Another step. The carpet beneath her feet felt soft, almost spongy, as if the fibers were beginning to melt. The posters had curled almost completely off the walls now, some of them smoldering at the edges. All Might's triumphant face had warped beyond recognition. "It's okay, baby," she whispered, tears cutting tracks through the sweat on her face. They evaporated almost instantly, leaving salt stinging in their wake. "Mama's here. Mama's got you. Everything's going to be okay." Another step. Her vision was blurring now, whether from tears or heat or something else entirely. The light on his chest pulsed brighter, its rhythm quickening. She was close enough now to see his face. His expression was still calm, still peaceful. Still the face of a child lost in innocent dreams, utterly unaware that his body had become a furnace, that the room was dying around him, that his mother was walking through an inferno to reach him. "I'm here," Inko breathed. Her voice cracked on the words. "I'm right here, sweetheart. I'm not going anywhere. I'm never going to leave you." She reached for him. The light over his chest flared. Brilliant. Blinding. A white so pure and absolute that it swallowed every shadow in the room, every shape, every color. For one frozen instant, Inko saw her own hands silhouetted against it, still reaching, still straining toward her son. And then the light swelled outward. It didn't explode. It didn't burst. It simply expanded. A sphere of radiance that grew and grew, warm and bright and impossibly gentle, swallowing everything in its path with quiet, terrible hunger. The last thing Inko Midoriya felt was warmth. Not burning. Not pain. Just warmth, like sunlight on a summer afternoon, wrapping around her like an embrace. Like her son's small arms around her neck. Like coming home after a long, hard day. She didn't scream. She didn't have time. For hours later and a few miles away, the sky had turned the color of a bruise. Smoke billowed upward in great black columns, blotting out the stars and painting the clouds an angry orange from the fires below. The air tasted of ash and something else, something metallic and sharp that coated the tongue and burned the back of the throat. Even from this distance, the heat pressed against exposed skin like the breath of some massive, slumbering beast. "All Might, stop!" The voice cut through the chaos, desperate and hoarse. A police officer was running toward him, one hand outstretched as if he could physically hold back the symbol of peace. His uniform was streaked with soot, his face glistening with sweat. Behind him, the command post was a hive of frantic activity. Officers shouting into radios. Paramedics rushing stretchers toward a growing line of ambulances. Heroes in torn costumes gulping water and catching their breath before plunging back into the inferno. "You can't go in there," the officer shouted, skidding to a halt in front of symbol of peace. His chest heaved with exertion. "The heat's too much for anyone, even you. Sir, please." His voice cracked, exhaustion and fear bleeding through the professional veneer. "We have to wait for Endeavor. He's the only one who can survive that temperature. We can't lose you." All Might's fists clenched at his sides, the leather of his gloves creaking under the pressure. 5 city blocks were ablaze. He could see them from here, great walls of flame reaching toward the heavens like grasping fingers. Buildings that had stood for decades were now nothing but skeletal frameworks wreathed in fire, their windows blown out, their walls crumbling. The streets between them had become rivers of molten glass and asphalt, glowing dull red in the darkness. And beyond the flames, where the destruction was worst, for more blocks had simply ceased to exist. No fire there. No rubble. Just a vast crater of scorched earth and liquefied stone, still radiating heat so intense that the air above it shimmered like a mirage. 9 blocks. 9 blocks of homes, businesses, lives. All of it gone in the span of a few seconds. And worse yet, it had all come from an out-of-control toddler's quirk. All Might had seen disasters before. Villain attacks that leveled shopping centers. Earthquakes that swallowed entire neighborhoods. The aftermath of battles between Quirks so powerful they reshaped the landscape itself. He had walked through ruins and pulled survivors from rubble and held the hands of the dying as they took their final breaths. But this was different. This wasn't a villain. This wasn't a natural disaster. This was a child. A 4-year-old boy who had probably been sleeping in his bed when his quirk first sparked to life, who had probably never hurt anyone in his short existence, who was probably terrified beyond all comprehension right now. And here he was. The so-called symbol of peace. The number one hero. The man who had sworn to protect everyone, to save everyone, to be the pillar upon which society could rest without fear. Forced to the sidelines while a child suffered alone in the heart of an inferno. How long until Endeavor arrives? All Might asked. His voice came out steadier than he felt, the practiced calm of a man who had learned long ago to bury his emotions behind a reassuring smile. The officer glanced at his radio, pressing it against his ear for a moment before responding. At least another hour, sir. He was on assignment in Osaka when the call went out. He's coming as fast as he can, but... An hour? 60 minutes. 3,600 seconds. How much more destruction would there be in an hour? How many more people would die? How much longer would that child have to sit alone in the center of hell, wondering why no one was coming to save him? All Might's jaw tightened. His smile never wavered, but behind it, something cold and sharp was twisting in his chest. Sir. Another officer came running up, younger than the first, clutching a laptop against his chest like a lifeline. His eyes were wide, his face pale beneath the layer of grime. Sir, they just got a view of the boy. From a high-altitude camera. The image is. You need to see this. Let me see, All Might said. It wasn't a request. Yes, sir. Right away, sir. The young officer fumbled with the laptop, nearly dropping it in his haste. They're filtering out the excess light now. The glare from whatever he's generating. It's been making imaging almost impossible. But they've got special filters and the image should clear any second now. Turn the screen toward All Might. At first, there was nothing but blinding white. A solid wall of radiance that seemed to pulse gently, like the beating of an enormous heart. The camera must have been miles up, some kind of high-altitude drone or satellite, yet even from that distance the light was intense enough to overwhelm the sensors. Then, slowly the filters kicked in. The glare dimmed. Shapes began to emerge from the whiteness, ghostly at first, then sharper. The edges of the crater came into focus, a perfect circle of destruction carved into the earth. The molten rivers of what had once been streets. The scattered remnants of buildings at the periphery, half standing, half collapsed. And at the center of it all, a small figure. A boy with green hair, matted and gray with ash. He sat with his knees pulled up to his chest, his arms wrapped around them, his face buried against his legs. His clothes were gone, burned away, leaving only bare skin that seemed to glow faintly with an inner light. Around him, the ground pulsed with a soft luminescence, like the embers of a dying fire. No older than 4. Sitting alone in the center of a vast crater of molten rubble. Alone. Surrounded by chaos and destruction and death. Probably terrified out of his mind. All Might stared at the image. His smile faltered for just an instant before he forced it back into place. But his eyes betrayed him. Something in them cracked. Something in them ached with a pain that went beyond words. What good was a hero who couldn't save a child? What good was all his power, all his strength, all his speed, if he couldn't reach one small boy crying alone in the dark? He thought of the people who looked up to him. The citizens who felt safe because he existed. The children who wore his merchandise and dreamed of being heroes. The villains who hesitated because they knew he was out there, watching, waiting. Symbol of peace. That's what they called him. That's what he had made himself into. But right now, standing here at the edge of the disaster zone, watching a 4-year-old suffer on a laptop screen. He had never felt less worthy of that title. All Might closed his eyes. Drew in a deep breath, filling his lungs with the ash-tainted air. Let it out slowly. Self-pity was a luxury he couldn't afford. Guilt was a weight he could carry later, when this was over, when the fires were out and the survivors were safe and the dead had been counted. Right now, there were still people who needed him. People trapped in buildings at the edge of the inferno. People injured and bleeding, waiting for rescue. People who might die in the next hour if he stood here wallowing in his own helplessness. If he couldn't save that boy right now, then he would save everyone else. Every single person he could reach. He would pull them from the flames and carry them to safety and make sure that when this night was over, the cost would be as small as humanly possible. And then, when Endeavor finally arrived and the child was contained, he would make it up to the boy. Somehow. He would find a way. He would do whatever it took to help that child recover from this nightmare. That was a promise. All Might opened his eyes. His smile was back, brighter than ever, burning with a determination that made the officers around him stand a little straighter. "Here," he shouted, moving the laptop back into the young officer's hands. The man fumbled to catch it, nearly dropping it again. "Take this. Keep monitoring the situation and inform me the moment anything changes." "Why, sir?" All Might turned toward the inferno. The heat washed over him, fierce and unrelenting, but he didn't flinch. Flames reflected in his eyes, dancing, roaring, hungry. "It's time I got to work." He crouched low, muscles coiling like springs, power gathering in his legs. "For I am here." And with those words, All Might launched himself into the sky, leaving a crater in the pavement where he'd stood. The shockwave of his departure sent papers scattering and officers stumbling, but no one complained. They just watched him go, a golden streak against the smoke-black sky, diving headfirst into hell. Because that's what heroes did, and he was the greatest of them all. The two officers stood in silence for a long moment, watching the golden streak disappear into the wall of smoke and flame. The roar of collapsing buildings filled the void left by All Might's departure, punctuated by the wail of sirens and the distant shouts of rescue workers. "Man," the younger one muttered, still clutching the laptop against his chest. His voice was rough, almost swallowed by the cacophony around them. "I hope he knows what he's doing." His partner didn't respond immediately. He was older, weathered, with the kind of face that had seen too many disasters and attended too many funerals. His eyes remained fixed on the spot where All Might had vanished into the inferno, his expression unreadable beneath the layer of soot and sweat. Around them, the command post churned with desperate activity. Firefighters hauled hoses toward the edge of the blaze, their protective gear already blackened and smoking from previous forays into the flames. Paramedics worked in grim silence, triaging the wounded with practiced efficiency, sorting the living from the dying with quick assessments and quicker decisions. A group of civilians huddled together near the ambulances, wrapped in shock blankets, their faces blank with the particular emptiness of people who had lost everything. "Dude." The younger officer grabbed his partner's shoulder, giving it a shake. "He's All Might. If anyone can handle this, it's him." The older man finally looked away from the flames. His eyes were tired, red-rimmed from the smoke, but something flickered in them. Not quite hope. Maybe just the memory of what hope used to feel like. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Yeah, I guess you're right." He didn't sound convinced. But he turned back to his post. Anyway, because there was work to be done and people to save, and standing around worrying about the number one hero wasn't going to help anyone. All around them, the heroes of Muzutafu fought their own battles against the blaze. Backdraft worked at the western edge of the disaster zone, his massive frame silhouetted against the flames as he directed streams of water from the hydrants he'd tapped into. His quirk let him control water pressure and direction with supernatural precision, and he used every ounce of that power now, sending jets of water arcing over burning buildings to hit the hottest spots. Steam billowed up wherever the water struck, great white clouds that mixed with the black smoke and turned the air into something barely breathable. "More pressure on Building 7, he bellowed, his voice barely audible over the roar. "The support beams are about to go. We've got 2 minutes, maybe less." A team of firefighters scrambled to comply, dragging another hose into position. Their movements were sluggish, exhausted, but they didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Not while there were still people trapped inside. Nearby, Manuel crouched beside a half-collapsed storefront, His hands pressed against the cheeks of a man who had been pulled from the rubble moments before. The victim's clothes were burned, his skin raw and blistered, his breathing shallow and wet. Manuel's quirk wasn't flashy. He couldn't fly or punch through walls or shoot fire from his hands. All he could do was manipulate small amounts of water with perfect control. But right now, that was enough. He drew moisture from the air itself, condensing it into a fine mist that he directed into the man's airways, soothing the burned tissue, helping him breathe. It wasn't a cure. It wasn't even close to adequate treatment. But it might keep the man alive long enough for the paramedics to reach him. "Stay with me," Manuel murmured, his voice calm despite the chaos around him. "Just a little longer. Help is coming. I've got you." The water hose duo sprinted past a moment later, their costumes scorched black, one of them half carrying an unconscious woman over his shoulder. They moved in perfect sync as they always did, their years of partnership evident in every step. The woman in their arms wasn't moving, but she was breathing. That was something. That was everything. "Trauma Tent 3, the wife shouted as they ran, not breaking stride. "Severe smoke inhalation and second-degree burns. She needs oxygen now." A paramedic was already running to meet them, oxygen mask in hand. Farther down the street, 13 worked in methodical silence. Her black hole quirk was dangerous under normal circumstances, capable of disintegrating anything it touched, but tonight she used it with surgical precision. Chunks of rubble that blocked rescue paths vanished into her fingertips, converted to dust and scattered on the wind. Collapsed beams that pinned survivors were carefully, delicately removed, one piece at a time. Her usual calm demeanor had been replaced by something harder. Grimmer. She had already pulled 6 people from the wreckage tonight. 3 of them had been alive. The other 3 hadn't. She didn't let herself think about the numbers. There would be time for grief later. Right now, there was only the next pile of rubble, the next trapped survivor, the next life that might be saved if she worked fast enough. At the southern perimeter, Power Loader carved trenches into the earth with his massive mechanical claws. The goal was containment. If they couldn't put out the fire, they could at least stop it from spreading. His excavation quirk let him tear through concrete and asphalt like tissue paper, creating fire breaks that the flames couldn't easily cross. It was brutal, thankless work. For every trench he dug, the fire seemed to find a new path forward. Embers carried on the wind. Underground gas lines that ruptured and ignited. The sheer radiant heat that could set buildings ablaze from 100 meters away. But he kept digging anyway. Because that's what heroes did. Every face was gray with ash. Every voice was hoarse from shouting. Every muscle ached, every joint screamed, every breath burned. The heroes of Muzutafu had been fighting for hours, and they looked it. Torn costumes, blistered skin, eyes red and streaming from the smoke. And not a single one of them slowed down. XXX. Hours crawled by. The smoke thickened until it blotted out the sky entirely, turning the night into something darker than darkness. The flames cast everything in shades of orange and red, painting the world in the colors of hell. Heroes stumbled on blistered feet, their gear burned and melted, their skin raw beneath. The air tasted of copper and melted plastic and something else, something organic, something no one wanted to think about too closely. The casualty list beside the command tent grew longer with every passing minute. A whiteboard had been set up, names scrawled in black marker, updated in real time as reports came in. The living on the left, the dead on the right, the missing in the middle, their fates still unknown. Nobody looked at it for long. There was always someone still screaming for help somewhere in the flames, and that demanded more attention than any list ever could. All Might worked tirelessly at the heart of it all. He appeared and disappeared like a golden ghost, carrying survivors in his arms, smashing through burning walls, leaping across rivers of molten stone. Every few minutes, he would emerge from the smoke with another rescued civilian, deposit them with the paramedics, and plunge back in without a word. His smile never faltered. His pace never slowed. But even he had limits. The closer he got to the crater's edge, the more the heat pushed back. The air itself seemed to reject him, growing so hot that even his incredible constitution began to fail. Twice he tried to force his way through to the boy at the center. He was driven back, his costume smoking, his skin reddening, his lungs screaming for air that wasn't superheated. The child remained out of reach. And still the hours passed. And still the flames burned. And still the heroes fought on, hoping against hope that they could save just one more life before their bodies gave out entirely. Then, finally, a shout went up from the eastern perimeter. "Look!" One of the water hose heroes was pointing at the sky, his voice cracking with exhaustion and something else. Something that might have been hope. "He's finally here. Everyone. It's Endeavor. He's finally here." Every head turned. Every eye looked up. Through the wall of heat and haze, a clear line of fire rocketed across the sky, cutting a glowing scar through the black smoke. It moved fast, faster than anything that size had a right to move, trailing flames in its wake like the tail of a comet. The heroes' flames were so bright they threw long shadows across the ground, making the destruction below look almost peaceful in comparison. The shout was met with a half-hearted cheer. Weak voices raised in tired relief. It wasn't enthusiastic. It wasn't triumphant. But it was genuine. For the first time in hours, the exhausted responders allowed themselves to believe that maybe, just maybe, this nightmare might finally be coming to an end. When Endeavor landed, the street shook under his boots. The impact left cracks in the pavement, spiderwebbing out from his feet like the aftermath of a small earthquake. The air bent around him, shimmering with the heat of his arrival, and the temperature rose noticeably in his immediate vicinity. His flames burned bright, wreathing his shoulders and face in a corona of fire that made it hard to look at him directly. He was massive, taller than any of the other heroes present, broader, more imposing. His costume was pristine, untouched by the ash and grime that coated everyone else. His beard of flames crackled and roared, casting dancing shadows across his stern features. And to everyone's shock and poorly concealed disgust, the man was smiling. Not the polite, practiced smile of a public figure arriving at a disaster scene. Not the grim, determined expression of a hero preparing to face a terrible challenge. This was something else entirely. A wild, fierce grin that spoke of excitement, of anticipation, of a man who had just been handed exactly the kind of challenge he lived for. "So," Endeavor said, his deep voice carrying easily over the sirens and the crackle of flames. He surveyed the destruction around him with those cold, calculating eyes, taking in the ruined buildings and the exhausted heroes and the wall of fire that still raged in the distance. "This is the disaster the so-called number one couldn't handle." A few of the nearby responders exchanged uneasy glances. The water hose hero who had announced his arrival looked away, his jaw tight. Endeavor didn't seem to notice. Or perhaps he simply didn't care. "Tell me what needs doing," he continued, striding forward with the casual confidence of a man who had never once doubted his own abilities. His flames flared brighter with each step, as if responding to his mood. And watch how a real hero works. The silence that followed was uncomfortable, heavy, filled with the unspoken thoughts of people too tired and too professional to say what they were really thinking. Finally, a nearby officer stepped forward. He was older than most of the others, with gray at his temples and deep lines carved into his face by years of stress and sleepless nights. He held a small metal case in his hands, cradling it carefully, almost reverently. "Sir," he said, forcing steadiness into his voice. He kept his eyes fixed on Endeavor's chin, unable or unwilling to meet that fierce gaze directly. "At the center of all this, you'll find a child." Endeavor's smile flickered. Just for an instant. Then it returned, though perhaps a shade less bright than before. "A child," he repeated. It wasn't quite a question. "Yes, sir. A 4-year-old boy. His quirk manifested earlier tonight and—" The officer paused, searching for the right words. "It's beyond anything we've ever seen. The heat he's generating is off every scale we have. We can't get accurate readings anymore. The instruments just fail." He opened the metal case, revealing its contents. Inside, nestled in a bed of heat-resistant foam, sat a small black dart. It gleamed dully in the firelight, its surface scored with tiny geometric patterns. "This is a special tungsten alloy," the officer explained. designed to withstand extreme temperatures. Inside is a compound that will sedate the boy and suppress his quirk long enough for containment teams to move in. All you have to do is get close enough to use it. Endeavor reached out and plucked the dart from its case, turning it over in his massive fingers. His flames dimmed slightly as he examined it, as if even his fire recognized the seriousness of the moment. "And if it fails?" he asked. His voice was quieter now, less theatrical. "If the alloy melts before I can reach him? If the sedative doesn't work, or if his quirk neutralizes the drag?" The officer's face went pale. Sweat cut clean lines through the soot on his skin, and his hands trembled slightly as he lowered the empty case. "You're the only one who can survive that heat," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper now, cracking under the weight of what he was about to say. "For the sake of Japan. For the sake of everyone still alive in this city." He drew a shaking breath, forced himself to meet Endeavor's eyes. "If there's no other choice, you have to kill the boy." The words hung in the air between them like a physical weight. Around them, the other responders had gone still. The crackle of flames seemed muted. Even the wind held its breath. Endeavor stared at the officer for a long moment. His expression was unreadable, his flames flickering in patterns that might have meant anything. Then, slowly, his smile faded. The wild excitement drained from his face, replaced by something colder, harder. The mask of a man who had just been reminded that the world was not, in fact, designed for his entertainment. "No," he said. Just the one word. Flat and final and utterly without room for argument. Before the officer could respond, before anyone could say anything at all, Endeavor crouched low. His flames roared to life around him, brighter than ever, a pillar of fire that made everyone nearby stumble backward from the sudden heat. And then he launched himself into the sky, trailing flames like the tail of a rocket, leaving nothing behind but scorched pavement and the echo of that single, absolute refusal. The flight was short, barely a minute from launch to destination. But in that minute, Endeavor saw enough to understand why all might had been stopped in his tracks. The world below was an ocean of flames. From up here, the destruction looked almost appealing in a terrible way. Rivers of molten glass and metal wound through the streets like veins of liquid fire, glowing orange and red and white where the heat was most intense. Buildings had been reduced to skeletal frameworks, their walls collapsed, their roofs caved in, nothing left but blackened beams reaching toward the sky like the fingers of drowning men. This part of Mizudafu was gone. Not damaged. Not recoverable. Simply erased from existence, as if a giant hand had reached down and scooped away everything that had once made it a neighborhood. The schools where children had learned. The shops where families had bought groceries. The homes where people had lived and laughed and loved. All of it reduced to slag and ash in memory. The heat grew more intense as he flew closer to the center. Even for him, even with a quirk that let him generate flames hot enough to melt steel, the temperature was pushing against his limits. His costume began to smoke at the edges. The air in his lungs felt like breathing inside a furnace. Sweat evaporated from his skin the instant it formed, leaving behind only salt and the faint sting of dehydration. He pushed through anyway. That was what he did. That was who he was. Enji Todoroki did not turn back. Enji Todoroki did not admit defeat. Enji Todoroki faced every obstacle head-on and crushed it beneath his heel, no matter the cost. The crater came into view. It was vast. Far larger than he had expected from the aerial footage. A perfect circle carved into the earth, its edges glassy and smooth where the heat had melted the stone itself. The ground at the bottom glowed a dull, sullen red, pulsing faintly like the heartbeat of some buried giant. Steam rose from cracks in the surface, hissing and spitting as groundwater met superheated rock. And at the center, small and alone and impossibly fragile against the scale of the destruction, sat a child. Endeavor slowed his descent, hovering in the air above the crater's edge. His flames dimmed slightly, instinctively conserving energy as he took in the sight before him. The boy couldn't have been more than 4 years old. His hair was green, though it was hard to tell beneath the layer of ash and grime that coated every strand. He sat with his knees pulled up to his chest, his small arms wrapped around them, his face buried against his legs. His clothes were gone, burned away completely, leaving only bare skin that seemed to glow with a faint inner light. Like embers banked beneath ash, waiting to flare back to life. He was shaking. Even from this distance, Endeavor could see the tremors running through that small body. The way his shoulders hitched with silent sobs. The way his fingers dug into his own arms, leaving red crescents in the skin. This was not a monster. This was not a villain. This was not some terrible threat that needed to be neutralized for the good of society. This was a terrified child who had no idea what was happening to him. Endeavor descended slowly, his flames guttering as he forced them lower to avoid startling the boy. The heat intensified with every meter he dropped, pressing against him like a physical weight. His costume was definitely smoking now. The metal clasps were growing hot enough to burn even his fire-resistant skin. He landed at the edge of the boy's immediate radius, perhaps 10 meters away. Close enough to see clearly. Far enough to give the child space. The ground beneath his boots was soft. Not quite liquid, but close. The soles of his boots sank slightly with each step, leaving shallow impressions that glowed briefly before cooling. "Boy," he called out, keeping his voice as steady as he could manage. It came out rougher than he intended, scraped raw by the heat. "Can you hear me?" For a long moment, there was no response. The child remained curled in on himself, shaking, lost in whatever private hell his mind had constructed. Then, slowly he lifted his head. His eyes were green. A bright, vivid green that seemed almost luminescent against the grime coating his face. Tear tracks had carved clean lines through the ash on his cheeks, and more tears welled in those eyes as he stared at the figure before him. At first, there was only confusion. The blank, uncomprehending gaze of a child who had been crying so long he had forgotten why he started. Then recognition flickered. The boy's eyes went wide. His mouth fell open. And despite everything, despite the destruction and the terror and the hours of lonely suffering, something like hope sparked to life in his expression. "Endeavor," he stammered. His voice was small and hoarse, cracked from crying and parched from the heat. But there was wonder in it. The unmistakable tone of a child who had just seen one of his heroes appear before him like a figure from a dream. He scrambled to his feet, swaying slightly, his legs unsteady beneath him. The light on his chest pulsed brighter for a moment, responding to his emotional state, but he didn't seem to notice. "Endeavor," he said again, louder this time. A smile was spreading across his face, wobbly and tearful but genuine. "You're here. You came. I knew. I knew a hero would come." Endeavor felt something twist in his chest. Something uncomfortable. Something he didn't want to examine too closely. Can't find my mommy," the boy continued, the words tumbling out in a rush. His small hands twisted together in front of him, ringing with nervous energy. "There's so much fire and she's lost and I don't know where she went and I've been calling and calling but she won't answer and—" His voice broke. Fresh tears spilled down his cheeks, cutting new tracks through the ash. Can you help me find her? Please? She's gone and I don't know where." The light on his chest flared brighter. A small sun beating just under his skin, pulsing in time with his racing heart. Endeavor's jaw tightened. He knew. Looking at this boy, listening to his desperate plea, he knew with absolute certainty what had happened. The mother wasn't lost. The mother wasn't hiding. The mother was gone, vaporized in an instant by the same power that had carved this crater into the earth. She had probably been the first casualty. This child had killed his own mother without even knowing it, had erased her from existence. And now he was asking Endeavor to help find her. For a moment, just a moment, something almost like pity stirred in Endeavor's chest. A faint echo of the father he might have been, in another life, if ambition hadn't consumed everything soft inside him. Then he crushed it. There was no time for sentiment. The boy's power was building. He could feel it in the air, a pressure that had nothing to do with temperature, a sense of something vast and terrible straining against invisible bonds. Every second he delayed was another second for that power to grow beyond anyone's ability to contain. He had to act now. Stay calm, Endeavor said, forcing his voice into something approximating gentleness. It didn't come naturally. The words felt awkward on his tongue, like speaking a language he had never properly learned. I need you to stay very calm for me. Can you do that? The boy nodded eagerly, wiping at his tears with the back of his hand. He was still smiling, still looking at Endeavor like he was salvation incarnate. I'm going to help you, Endeavor continued, moving closer. His costume was smoking badly now. He could feel the heat seeping through the fire-resistant fabric, prickling against his skin. But first, I need you to hold very still. Can you do that for me? Another nod. The boy straightened up, trying so hard to be brave. Trying so hard to be good. Trying to make this hero proud of him. Endeavor's hand moved. Quick. Practiced. Smooth. The dart left his fingers before the boy could even register the movement, crossing the distance between them in the span of a heartbeat. It struck true. The tungsten alloy bit into the boy's shoulder, embedding itself in the soft flesh just below the collarbone. The sedative began to deploy immediately, flooding his small body with chemicals designed to suppress Quirk activity. The boy stumbled. His eyes went wide, unfocused, confused. He looked down at the dart protruding from his shoulder, then back up at Endeavor, and the betrayal in his expression was almost unbearable to witness. He tried to say. His voice was slurring already, the sedative working faster than expected. Why did you? His knees buckled. He collapsed to the ground, catching himself on his hands, fighting to stay conscious even as his body failed him. And then, as he fell, his hand rose. It wasn't a conscious decision. Endeavor could see that immediately. There was no malice in the gesture, no intent to harm. It was pure instinct. The reflexive response of a child whose body had just been hurt, reaching out toward the source of the pain. Reaching out to push it away. His palm opened toward the approaching hero. And the air ignited. A small sphere of plasma bloomed to life in the palm of his hand. Almost as if called from the surface of the sun itself. Gathering and condensing, growing brighter and denser with each passing heartbeat. What? Blinding. Hotter than anything Endeavor had ever felt, hotter than his own flames at their most intense. Then it launched. The sphere tore free from the boy's palm and rocketed across the distance between them. It didn't seem fast as adrenaline flooded his system, making it almost look like it moved with an almost lazy grace, drifting through the air like a soap bubble. Appealing. Terrible. Inevitable. Endeavor didn't move. He couldn't. His legs had turned to stone. His arms hung limp at his sides. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to dodge, to dive, to throw himself out of the path of that terrible approaching light, but the signals never reached his limbs. He was frozen, paralyzed, pinned in place by something far deeper than fear. His own flames recoiled, shrinking before the light like shadows fleeing the dawn. They pressed flat against his body, guttering and weak, flames that had never once faltered in decades of heroism now cowering like whipped dogs. The fire that had defined him, that had shaped his entire identity, recognized something greater than itself. And surrendered. For a moment he felt hollow. Weightless. As if everything that had ever made him Endeavor, the number 2 hero, was being stripped away layer by layer. Leaving nothing behind but a man named Enji who had spent his entire life chasing something he could never catch. Then laughter clawed its way out of him. Uneven. The sound scraped against his throat like broken glass, harsh and jagged and utterly without humor. It echoed across the crater, bouncing off the glassed walls, mixing with the roar of the approaching light until he couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. A child. A 4-year-old child. Radiating power beyond every calculation, beyond every scale, beyond every limit he had built his life around. The sphere of light drifted closer, lazy and inexorable, and Endeavor couldn't look away. Didn't want to look away. There was something almost hypnotic about it. Something appealing in its terrible inevitability. All those years. The thought crashed through him like a wave, dragging memories in its wake. Decades of them. A lifetime of choices and sacrifices and compromises, all leading to this moment. This crater. This child. This light. the endless training. He remembered the dojos of his youth, the fireproof chambers of his adulthood, the countless hours spent pushing his quirk harder and harder. The burns on his hands before he learned control. The exhaustion that became so constant he forgot what rest felt like. The injuries he trained through because stopping meant admitting weakness. The sphere grew brighter, closer. He could feel its heat pressing against his face now, more intense than his own flames had ever been. The sleepless nights chasing a ghost. All those hours lying awake in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, running calculations in his head. How much stronger did he need to become? How many more villains did he need to defeat? How many more records did he need to break before the world finally saw him as worthy? The rankings. Number 10. Number 7. Number 5. Number 3. And finally, after everything, number 2. Always number 2. The eternal runner-up. The man who came close but never close enough. Closer still. The edges of his costume began to smoke and curl. The interviews. Sitting under hot lights, answering the same questions over and over again. What's it like being the number 2 hero? Do you think you'll ever surpass All Might? How does it feel to always be second best? He had smiled through every one of them. That tight, controlled smile that hid the acid burning in his chest. The hollow pride. Trophies that meant nothing. Commendations that felt like consolation prizes. The respect of his peers that always came with an unspoken asterisk. Yes, Endeavor is impressive, but he's no All Might. The light was so close now. He could see nothing else. His vision had narrowed to that single point of radiance, that sphere of pure destruction drifting toward him with the patience of something that knew it could not be stopped. And still the memories came. The marriage he turned into a breeding project. Appealing, quiet Ray, with her ice quirk and her gentle smile. He had chosen her like a farmer choosing livestock. Evaluated her genetics. Calculated probabilities. Negotiated with her family as if he were purchasing property rather than proposing to a human being. He had told himself it was practical, strategic, the logical next step in his plan to create what he could not become. But it wasn't strategy. It was obsession. Madness dressed in the clothing of ambition. His skin was begun to blister. The children he broke because he couldn't break All Might. His firstborn. The boy whose flames burned hotter than his father's, so hot they damaged the body that produced them. Endeavor remembered the training sessions. Tuya screaming as his skin cracked and blistered. Tuya begging to stop. And Endeavor's voice, cold and relentless. More. Finn. You have to be perfect. The burns had accumulated until his son was more scar than skin. Until the light in his eyes had curdled into something dark and twisted and full of hate. The heat was unbearable now. His costume was disintegrating, the fire-resistant fabric simply ceasing to exist wherever the light touched it. Fuyumi, his daughter, ice without fire, useless for his purposes. He remembered the disappointment on his face when her test results came back. He remembered her seeing it, the way her small shoulders had slumped, the way she had smiled anyway, that desperate, pleading smile that begged for approval he never gave. She had spent her childhood trying to compensate for her genetic failure, trying to be useful in other ways, taking care of her siblings, keeping the household running, smiling that forced smile until it became a mask she couldn't remove. Natsuo, his second son, another failure, another child he had simply stopped seeing, delegated to tutors and nannies and eventually forgotten, because why invest time in something that couldn't fulfill its purpose? Now Natsuo was... He didn't even know how old his son was now. Flinched at his father's voice. And now this. A boy who hadn't even started school. Whose power didn't burn. It consumed. It transcended. It existed on a scale that made Endeavor's flames look like simple matches. A boy who hadn't reached for glory. Hadn't trained for demps. Hadn't dedicated his life to surpassing anyone or proving anything. He was just crying for his mother. And yet the sun itself had answered him. Endeavor's laughter faltered, cracking into a hoarse whisper. I wanted to create someone who could surpass him. All those years. What was the point? I just wanted to show the world that I was stronger. Better. That all my suffering, all my sacrifice, meant something. The heat roared around him, pressing down like judgment. Like condemnation. Like the weight of every terrible choice finally coming due. But this. And then there was Shoto. His masterpiece. His perfect creation. Fire and ice in one body, the combination he had spent years trying to produce. Shoto had been everything Endeavor had hoped for and more. Powerful. Controlled. Capable of feats that should have been impossible for a child his age. And now, absolutely terrified of his own father. The fear in Shoto's eyes. The way the boy flinched whenever he entered a room. The way he had learned to suppress every emotion, to become as cold and distant as the ice he wielded, because showing weakness meant inviting punishment. The way he refused, stubbornly and absolutely, to ever use his fire. As if by rejecting half his quirk, he could reject the man who had given it to him. All of it. All of them. Sacrificed for a dream that had already died. That had perhaps never been alive at all. Because no matter how bright he burned, no matter how hard he pushed himself or how many lives he ruined, how could he ever hope to match the sun? XXX. 2 hours later, the city had gone quiet. Not peaceful. Not calm. But exhausted. The fires still smoldered at the edges of the disaster zone, sending thin ribbons of smoke curling up toward a sky. The flames that had raged for hours were finally dying, starved of fuel, beaten back by the tireless efforts of heroes and firefighters who had given everything they had. The sirens had faded to a distant echo. The shouting had stopped. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath, as if the world itself was too tired to move. All Might trudged through the cooling ash. His every step crunched on loose debris. Broken glass. Shattered concrete. The remnants of lives that had been whole just hours ago, reduced now to rubble and memory. His boots sank slightly with each footfall, the ground still soft from the residual heat, and he had to watch his footing carefully to avoid the worst of the unstable patches. His smile was gone. He couldn't remember the last time he had let it fall like this. In public, surrounded by people who might see, who might photograph, who might lose faith in the symbol of peace if they saw him looking anything less than confident. But there was no one here. No cameras. No civilians. Just ash and ruin and the weight of everything he had failed to prevent. Even after 2 hours, the ground still radiated a weary heat. The temperature had dropped significantly from its peak, but it was still hot enough to make sweat bead along his hairline, hot enough to make each breath feel thick and heavy in his lungs. The other responders had established a perimeter nearly a kilometer back, unable to venture any closer without specialized equipment. No one else could enter this deep. The thermal specialists had tried with their protective suits and cooling systems, only to be driven back within minutes. The heat was simply too intense, too pervasive, too relentless. Even he was honestly pushing his tolerance limit. All Might could feel it in his muscles. His body was warning him that this was too much, that he needed to stop, that continuing forward was pushing past the boundaries of what even the #1 hero could safely endure. He ignored it. He had no choice. Endeavor should have returned hours ago. The #2 hero had plunged into the heart of the disaster with his characteristic bravado, promising results, promising to show everyone how a real hero handled a crisis. That had been nearly 3 hours ago. The last communication from him had been a burst of static over the radio, garbled and unintelligible, and then nothing. Something had gone wrong. For an hour after the heat had started dropping, the response teams had waited, hoping, praying, telling themselves that Endeavor was just taking his time, that he was securing the child, that he would emerge any moment with that arrogant smirk and some dismissive comment about how easy it had been. He never emerged. And so All Might had made a decision. The perimeter be DMED. The safety protocols be DMED. The worried shouts of the officers who tried to stop him be DMED. He was going in, and this time, nothing was going to stand in his way. The crater's rim came into view. All Might slowed his pace, his eyes scanning the devastation ahead. The ground here was different from the rubble behind him. Smoother. Glacier. The heat had been so intense that it had fused the earth itself, turning soil and stone into something that looked almost like obsidian. It reflected the gray sky above in dark, warped mirrors. He stopped at the edge and looked down. What he saw stripped the last of his strength away. For a long moment he simply stood there, frozen, as shock set in like ice water flooding his veins. Both Endeavor and the child lay unconscious at the bottom of the crater. The boy was closest to the center, curled on his side in the fetal position. His small body rose and fell with the shallow rhythm of sleep, and a faint glow pulsed beneath the skin of his chest. Barely noticeable, like the last ember of a fire that had burned itself out. And Endeavor, All Might's breath caught in his throat. A molten line stretched from the boy's position, carving a deep furrow into the earth that extended for dozens of meters before tapering off. The glass along its edges still glowed faintly orange, cooling slowly in the aftermath of whatever had created it. The trajectory was unmistakable. It pointed directly from the child to a crumpled figure lying off to the side. Endeavor lay where he had fallen, his massive body twisted at an awkward angle against a pile of fused rubble. His costume was gone, burned away completely, leaving only scraps of melted fabric clinging to his skin. His beard of flames had been extinguished, leaving his face bare and strangely vulnerable without its usual corona of fire. And his right arm ended not far below the shoulder in a blackened ruin. The flesh there had been cauterized instantly, seared closed by the same heat that had taken the limb. There was no blood, just smooth, dark tissue that looked more like charcoal than human skin. All Might had seen injuries before. Terrible injuries. The kind of wounds that haunted a hero's nightmares long after the battles that caused them had ended. But something about this felt different. Something about seeing the number 2 hero laid low so completely, so absolutely, made his stomach turn in a way he hadn't experienced in years. He slid down the slope. His boots sank into the ash and loose rubble, sending small avalanches of debris tumbling ahead of him. The cooling heat radiated through his soles, hot enough to be uncomfortable but no longer hot enough to burn. By the time he reached the bottom, his costume was coated in gray dust. The child first. All Might crossed the glassy ground carefully, his footsteps echoing strangely in the silence of the crater. The boy didn't stir as he approached. His small chest rose and fell in that same slow, steady rhythm, undisturbed by the approaching footsteps. He knelt beside him. Up close, the child looked even smaller than he had on the laptop screen. Fragile. Impossibly fragile, given the devastation that surrounded him. His green hair was matted with ash and sweat, plastered to his forehead in tangled curls. His face was streaked with dried tears, the tracks still visible beneath the layer of grime. His lips were cracked and parched, and on his chest, barely visible through the dirt, a faint white-gold light pulsed in time with his heartbeat. All Might reached out, stopping inches above the boy's skin. Even now, the child gave off heat. Not burning anymore. Not dangerous. Just warm, like someone who had spent too long in a sauna, like a fever that was finally breaking. The warmth pressed against All Might's palm, gentle and steady, a stark contrast to the inferno it had been just hours before. For a long moment he said nothing. What could he say? What words could possibly be adequate for this situation? A 4-year-old boy who had destroyed 9 city blocks without even waking up. A child whose quirk had manifested with enough power to rival, to surpass anything All Might had ever seen. A little boy who had lost everything tonight without ever knowing it. "I'm here, young man," he said softly. His voice came out rougher than he intended, scraped raw by the heat and the ash and the weight of everything he was feeling. But he made himself say the words anyway. Made himself offer that small comfort, even if the child couldn't hear it. "I'm here. You're safe now. I've got you." He slid one arm under the boy, cradling him as gently as if he might shatter at the slightest pressure. The child was light. So light. All Might could feel every rib beneath the skin, every delicate bone, every fragile piece of this small person who had no idea what he had done or what had been done to him. The light on the boy's chest pulsed once against All Might's arm, warm and soft. Then it dimmed again, fading to almost nothing, as if even the quirk itself was exhausted. All Might held him for a moment longer than necessary. Just held him. This small, Impossibly powerful child who had destroyed everything around him and somehow survived. Then he turned toward Endeavor. The number 2 hero was breathing. All Might could see the shallow rise and fall of his chest, the faint twitch of his fingers against the rubble beneath him. But even from here, it was clear that he didn't have long without medical attention. The burns covering the right side of his body were severe. 3rd degree at minimum, possibly worse. The stump of his arm oozed slightly, the cauterized tissue beginning to crack as it cooled. All Might shifted the boy to one arm, securing him carefully against his chest, and reached down with his other hand. Endeavor was heavy. Even for All Might, lifting the massive man with one arm while cradling a child with the other was a challenge. The number 2 hero's body was dense with muscle, weighted down by years of intensive training, and the dead weight of unconsciousness made him even harder to manage. Every bit of All Might's training told him not to move him. That doing so could make things worse. That jostling a burn victim with traumatic injuries could cause additional damage, could worsen the shock, could push an already failing body past the point of recovery. But given the circumstances, he knew he didn't have a choice. No medical team could reach them here. The heat was still too intense for normal humans, even with protective equipment. If Endeavor was going to survive, someone had to carry him out. And All Might was the only one who could. He lifted the large man over his shoulder, grunting slightly with the effort. Endeavor's head lolled against his back, his breathing shallow and wet. The burned skin crackled faintly as it shifted, a sound that made All Might's jaw tighten. "Hold on," he murmured, though he wasn't sure which of his 2 burdens he was talking to. "We're almost out. Just hold on a little longer." Moving slowly, carefully, one foot in front of the other, All Might began the long climb out of the crater. The world beyond the crater's edge came back in fragments. Sirens first. Distant and uneven, their wails rising and falling like the breathing of some great wounded beast. They had been a constant backdrop for hours, so omnipresent that All Might had stopped hearing them consciously. Now, as he climbed, they filtered back into his awareness one by one. Ambulances. Fire trucks. Police vehicles. The soundtrack of disaster response, playing on an endless loop. Then the crunch of boots over glassed pavement. His own footsteps, heavy and deliberate, each one sending small showers of debris skittering down the slope behind him. The ground was treacherous here, a mixture of fused glass and loose rubble that shifted unpredictably with every step. He had to move carefully, had to balance the weight of the man on his shoulder against the fragile child in his arm, had to watch his footing while his muscles screamed for rest. Then the hard white glare of floodlights cutting through the smoke. They had set up a forward observation post at the edge of the safe zone, as close as they dared to venture without specialized protection. Massive spotlights mounted on trucks, their beams slicing through the haze to illuminate the path ahead. All Might squinted against the brightness, his eyes struggling to adjust after so long in the orange-tinged darkness of the crater. He didn't call out. He didn't have the breath for it. He just kept walking, one foot in front of the other, his body moving on autopilot while his mind floated somewhere distant and numb. One arm hooked under Endeavor's ruined torso, the other cradling the child against his chest, the weight of both pressing down on him with every step. The air was still oven-hot and dry enough to sting the lungs. Every breath felt like inhaling sand, coarse and scratching and utterly devoid of moisture. His throat had gone raw hours ago, and now each inhale brought fresh pain. But he kept breathing, kept walking, kept moving forward, because that was what heroes did. Figures appeared ahead. Containment crews in their heavy thermal suits, bulky silhouettes against the floodlights. They had been waiting at the edge of the safe zone for hours, ready to move in the moment conditions allowed. Their equipment gleamed dully in the artificial light. Specialized stretchers, cooling apparatus, medical gear designed for exactly this kind of situation. They froze for an instant when they saw him. Even through their visors, even at this distance, they recognized the silhouette of the number 1 hero. That distinctive shape, those broad shoulders, that presence that seemed to fill any space he occupied, even now, even exhausted and burdened and covered in ash. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then the radios crackled to life. Symbol in sight. The voice was tinny through the radio speakers, distorted by static and interference from the residual heat. But the words carried clearly, spreading through the command post like ripples in a pond. He's got two. Repeat, 2 survivors. 1 adult and 1 child. The effect was immediate. The frozen tableau shattered into motion. Crews that had been waiting tensely for hours suddenly burst into action, training taking over as they rushed to prepare for the incoming casualties. Stretchers were wheeled forward. Medical equipment was powered up. Containment protocols were initiated. All Might's legs nearly gave out as he reached the edge of the safe zone. The transition was stark. One moment he was walking on glassed earth, heat radiating up through his boots. The next he was standing on normal pavement, cool and solid, surrounded by people in clean uniforms who hadn't spent the last several hours breathing ash and fighting fires. He set Endeavor down first. Carefully, gently, lowering the massive man onto the pavement with as much control as his trembling arms could manage. Endeavor's body was a mess, a ruin of burned flesh and melted costume and that terrible absence where his right arm should have been. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor beneath the burns, and his breathing was shallow enough that All Might had to watch closely to confirm it was still happening. Armor fused into flesh. Skin burned black on his right side. The stump of his arm, cauterized and cracked, leaking clear fluid through the damaged tissue. Shallow breaths rasping through clenched teeth. For a moment, no one moved. The responders who had rushed forward so eagerly seemed to stall, their momentum dying as they took in the sight before them. This was the number 2 hero. The man who commanded flames hot enough to melt steel. The most powerful fire user in Japan, possibly in the world. And he was broken. Shattered. Reduced to a burned and mutilated body on the pavement, missing a limb, barely clinging to life. Seeing him like this, laid so low, so completely defeated. It shook even the most seasoned responders. Some of them had worked disasters for decades. Had seen heroes injured, crippled, killed. But something about this felt different. Something about the number 2 hero lying helpless in a pool of floodlight, his flames extinguished, his power stripped away, drove home the reality of what had happened here tonight in a way that nothing else could. "Get a trauma pod down here," someone shouted, the words cutting through the paralysis. "Now, move." The spell broke. A pair of medics sprinted forward with a reinforced stretcher, its frame designed to handle extreme temperatures and heavy loads. They worked with practiced efficiency, communicating in terse shorthand as they assessed the situation. On 3. 1, 2, 3. They eased Endeavor onto the stretcher, careful not to jostle his injuries any more than necessary. Another medic appeared with a canister of cooling agent, spraying a fine mist across his burned skin. It hissed where it touched, the medication reacting with the residual heat, and Endeavor's face twitched slightly at the sensation. Still unconscious. Still fighting to survive. Sensors blinked to life along the stretcher frame, monitoring his vitals. Most of them glowed red. Critical. Failing. Barely within acceptable parameters. "He's still breathing," one medic barked, her voice tight with controlled urgency. Weak pulse. Severe thermal trauma across his right side. Traumatic amputation of the right arm, cauterized at the wound site. She looked up at her partner, her eyes hard behind her visor. "Tell the hospital to prepare the burn ward. Tell them to prepare everything. This is going to be bad." "Worse than bad," her partner muttered, but he was already reaching for his radio. All Might stayed beside Endeavor until the stretcher began to move. He watched them wheel the number 2 hero toward the waiting ambulance, watched the doors close behind him, watched the vehicle pull away with its lights flashing and its sirens wailing. Then he turned his attention to the child still cradled against his chest. The boy hadn't stirred through any of it. The shouting, the movement, the bright lights and loud sirens. He remained unconscious, his small body limp in All Might's arm, his breathing slow and steady. The faint light under his skin pulsed weakly, a soft white gold glow that made every face around them look pale and ghostly. "Thermal stabilizer capsule," another medic called out. "We need the capsule over here, stat." 2 technicians rolled up with a small containment cradle. It looked almost like a coffin, All Might thought, and immediately wished he hadn't. The alloy sides glowed with a dull sheen, reflecting the floodlights, and when they opened it carefully, the interior shimmered as cool air from within met the residual heat radiating from the child. All Might looked down at the boy in his arms. So small. So fragile. So utterly unaware of the devastation he had caused, the lives he had ended, the world he had shattered around him. His face was peaceful in sleep, his features soft and childlike, smudged with ash and streaked with dried tears. He bent and laid the child inside himself. Gently, carefully, arranging the small limbs so they rested comfortably against the padded interior. The boy's head lolled slightly as All Might withdrew his hands, settling against the cradle's surface with a soft sound. The capsule's sensors chirped to life. Warning tones at first, high and insistent, reacting to the residual temperature spikes still emanating from the boy's skin. Then, slowly, the readings began to stabilize. The warnings faded. A steady rhythm took their place, monitoring heartbeat and temperature and Quirk activity. The head nurse checked the readings, her voice tight but steady through her mask. Core temp stabilizing. Quirk activity is minimal. We've got him. All Might nodded. But he didn't step back. Not yet. His gloves rested on the capsule's edge, thick fingers curled around the cool metal. His breathing was ragged, each inhale burning cold in his throat after hours of superheated air. Exhaustion pulled at every muscle, every joint, every fiber of his being. But he couldn't seem to make himself let go. "Be careful," he said quietly. His voice was rough, barely recognizable. The voice of a man who had pushed himself past every limit he had, and was only now realizing how little he had left. He's just a child. He didn't ask for this. He didn't choose any of this. He paused, swallowing against the dryness in his throat. Whatever happens next, remember that. He's just a child. The nurse nodded. Her eyes, visible above her mask, softened slightly. "We'll take care of him, sir. I promise." All Might held her gaze for a moment. Then, slowly, he withdrew his hands from the capsule's edge. When he finally stepped back, the emergency responders moved as one. Endeavor's stretcher was already gone, loaded into an ambulance that was even now speeding toward the nearest trauma center. Now the child's capsule was sealed with a soft hiss of pressurized air, the transparent lid clicking into place. Technicians lifted it onto a specialized gurney, its wheels squeaking slightly as they turned toward another waiting vehicle. The lights from the convoy strobed red and blue across the blackened street. They caught on melted glass and twisted rebar, painting the destruction in pulses of color. Emergency vehicles lined the road, their engines idling, their crews ready to move at a moment's notice. 2 ambulances pulled away simultaneously. Endeavor toward the burn unit. The child toward a facility equipped for Quirk containment. Their sirens wailed in discordant harmony as they disappeared into the haze of smoke and floodlight. All Might stood alone in their wake. The crowd of responders had dispersed, each returning to their assigned tasks. There were still fires to fight. Still survivors to find. Still bodies to recover. The disaster wasn't over, even if the immediate crisis had passed. There would be work here for days, weeks, maybe longer. But for this one moment, All Might allowed himself to stop. He stood in the middle of the ruined street, surrounded by ash and debris and the fading echoes of sirens. The floodlights cast his shadow long across the ground, stretching toward the crater behind him. His costume was torn and scorched, his cape hanging in tatters, his gloves blackened with soot. The silence that followed wasn't peace. It was just exhaustion. The bone-deep weariness of a man who had given everything he had and still felt like it wasn't enough. The hollow ache of knowing that despite all his power, despite all his strength, despite being the symbol of peace itself, he had been helpless when it mattered most. He had saved the boy. He had saved Endeavor. He had pulled dozens of people from the flames over the course of this endless night. But he hadn't been able to stop any of it. He hadn't been able to reach the child before the disaster began. Hadn't been able to prevent the 9 blocks of destruction. Hadn't been able to do anything but watch from the sidelines while a 4-year-old boy's Quirk tore the world apart around him. What good was a symbol of peace who couldn't prevent catastrophe? What good was the number one hero who arrived after the damage was already done? The questions had no answers. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. All Might drew a deep breath. Let it out slowly. Felt the weight of the night pressing down on his shoulders like a physical force. Then he straightened. His smile returned. Not the bright, confident grin he showed to cameras and civilians. Something smaller, quieter. A private expression meant for no one but himself. He looked once more at the fading lights of the ambulances as they drove off into the distance. Two small beacons of red and blue, growing smaller and smaller until they were swallowed by the smoke and the darkness. "I'll make it right," he murmured. The words were soft, almost inaudible. A promise made to no one and everyone at the same time. He didn't know how. Didn't know what making it right would even look like in the aftermath of something like this. The boy would need help, support, years of therapy and training and careful guidance to learn control over a power that had already cost so many lives. Endeavor would need to recover, to rebuild, to face whatever reckoning awaited him when he woke up and realized what he had lost. The city would need to mourn, to rebuild. Some way to move forward after a disaster that had no villain to blame, no enemy to fight, no clear narrative of good versus evil that could make sense of the senseless. And All Might himself. He didn't know what he needed. Didn't know how to process what he had seen tonight, what he had felt, the helplessness that had clawed at him for hours while he watched a child suffer alone in the heart of an inferno. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would find a way. He would be there for that boy. Would help him learn to control his power. Would make sure he never had to face something like this alone again. Would be the hero that child needed, even if it took years, even if it cost everything he had. That was a promise. All Might turned away from the ambulances and looked toward the inferno still burning at the edges of the disaster zone. Heroes and firefighters were still working there, still fighting to contain the damage, still saving lives one at a time. He rolled his shoulders, cracked his neck, summoned what remained of his strength from reserves he hadn't known he still had. The night wasn't over yet. There was still work to be done. And the symbol of peace did not rest while there were people who needed saving. With one last glance toward the distant lights of the departing ambulances, All Might turned and walked back toward the flames. It had been 3 months since what was being called the Muzutafu Calamity, with a confirmed death toll of 2,267 people and 576 injured. At first, the city existed in a state of collective shock, a held breath that refused to release. Families stayed close together, doors locked, curtains drawn, as if the walls of their homes could protect them from something that had erased 9 city blocks in an instant. Some kept their phones clutched in trembling hands, desperately waiting for a call from loved ones who had simply stopped existing, hoping against hope that they would walk through the door with some miraculous explanation, fearing the call that would confirm they never would. Slowly, painfully, the city began to move again. Shock gave way to grief, and grief demanded ritual. Candlelight vigils sprouted across Muzutafu, first dozens, then hundreds. Shrines of flowers and photographs appeared on street corners, in parks, outside schools. The funerals started soon after. Far too many featured empty caskets, closed ceremonies for bodies that had been vaporized so completely that not even ash remained for the families to bury. But grief, left to fester without answers, eventually curdles into something darker. It wasn't long before the fragile peace began to crack and questions started to be had this happened. The death toll was staggering, greater than any villain attack in decades, greater than most natural. Didn't the heroes stop it? They were supposed to protect people. That was the entire foundation of hero society, the promise that justified everything. And yet, over 2,000 people were dead and no one would explain why. The building rage was without logic, born of grief and sorrow rather than reason. It was stoked by constant media coverage, the 24-hour news cycle that fed on tragedy like oxygen. Every channel ran memorial segments. Every talk show featured crying families. Every newspaper published photographs of the dead. Then came the interview that changed everything. XXX. The program was called Evening Truth, a middling news magazine that typically covered local politics and human interest stories. They had landed the interview almost by accident. A producer who knew someone who knew the Sato family, a hastily scheduled segment meant to be one memorial among many. No one expected it to set the city on fire. Rikudo Sato's parents sat rigid on the studio couch, dressed in dark formal wear that hung off them like borrowed clothes. The mother, a soft-faced woman with her son's broad build, kept her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. The father sat beside her, jaw clenched so hard the muscles in his neck stood out like cables. Between them, propped on a small stand, was a framed photograph of two children. A stocky boy with a wide, gap-toothed smile, and a smaller girl with pigtails leaning against his shoulder. Rikudo was 8 years old, the mother began, her voice barely above a whisper. The interviewer, a middle-aged woman with practiced sympathy, leaned forward attentively. He was visiting his grandmother with his little sister, Yumi. She was 5. They loved going there because she always let them have extra dessert. Her voice cracked. She pressed a hand to her mouth, composing herself with visible effort. They were only supposed to be there for the weekend, the father continued, his voice flat in the way that spoke of carefully contained fury. We had the bakery to run. Sato Family Sweets. My father started it, and his father before him. Rikudo loved it there. He was always in the kitchen with us, making a mess, trying to help. The interviewer nodded gently. I understand he had dreams of becoming a hero? Something shifted in the mother's expression, a flicker of light in all that grief. She reached into her purse and withdrew a piece of paper, unfolding it with trembling hands. He drew this last month. He was so proud of it. The camera zoomed in on the drawing, and living rooms across the city saw what she held, a child's crayon sketch of a muscular figure in a bright yellow costume, fists raised triumphantly. The proportions were wrong in the way all children's drawings were wrong, arms too long, head too big, but the joy in it was unmistakable. Beside the figure, in wobbly handwriting, were the words, Sugarman, hero of sweets. He wanted to be a hero who made people smile, the mother said, tears streaming freely now. He said his quirk was going to be something amazing, that he would save people and then bake them cookies to make them feel better. He was 8 years old. He was a good boy, the father added, and for the first time his composure cracked. His voice came out ragged, choked. He looked after his sister. He did his homework. He was gone. And now he's just gone. Both of them. In a flash of light. No warning, no chance, no. He stopped, pressing a fist against his mouth. The mother took his other hand. There was nothing left, she whispered. Nothing to bury. The heroes, the government. They tell us it was a quirk accident. An accident. As if that explains anything. As if that gives us any closure. The father's head snapped up, and when he spoke again, his voice had turned to steel wrapped in fire. We want answers. Japan wants answers. Over 2,000 people are dead, and no one will tell us who did this. No one will tell us our son, our children, they deserve more than accident. They deserve justice. XXX. The interview aired at 7 p.m. on a Tuesday evening. By midnight, clips had spread to every corner of the internet. The image of Rikudo's hero drawing, Sugarman, hero of sweets, became something no one could have predicted. Within days, it appeared on protest signs, on memorial shirts, on murals painted across the city. His gap-toothed smile stared out from 1,000 photographs, 1,000 candles, 1,000 clenched fists raised against the sky. Justice for Rikudo became the rallying cry. Not because he was more important than the other 2,266 victims, but because his story had broken through at exactly the right moment. He was young, he was innocent, he had dreamed of being a hero who baked cookies. He was understandably in a way that raw death tolls could never be. The city's grief needed a face, and Rikudo Sato became that face. But grief without a target is a wildfire without direction. XXX. The pressure on the government and hero agencies had been building since the first week. Protesters gathered outside the National Diet Building, holding signs demanding transparency. Who did this? Became a constant chant, echoing through the streets of Tokyo. Hero agencies across the country faced picket lines, angry citizens demanding to know why the symbol of peace himself hadn't prevented the tragedy. Politicians sweated under the harsh lights of press conferences, deflecting questions with practiced non-answers. The investigation is ongoing. We are committed to public safety. Details cannot be released at this time for security reasons. It wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. Talking heads on news programs openly questioned whether the Hero Public Safety Commission was engaged in a cover-up. Opposition lawmakers called for emergency hearings. Social media became a churning sea of theories, accusations, and rage. And through it all, the government held the line. The identity of the person responsible remained classified. The why remained unanswered. XXX. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does human fear. Without a face to blame, without a target for their grief and terror, people began to find their own. It started in the dark corners of the internet, forums and message boards where old prejudices had always festered, waiting for an opportunity. But it spread quickly into the daylight. Had to be a mutant, the posts claimed. No normal quirk could do that kind of damage. Check the heteromorph registries. Someone that dangerous has to be obvious. How many of them are walking around like ticking time bombs? How long until the next one goes off? The logic was non-existent, a desperate grasping for something, anything, to explain the inexplicable. But fear doesn't require logic. It only requires a target. Anti-heteromorph sentiment had always existed in the shadows of quirk society, an ugly undercurrent that most people preferred to pretend wasn't there. Now it surged into the open. Old hate groups found new members. New organizations emerged with names like Humanity First and the Baseline Coalition, their rhetoric dressed up in the language of safety and concern. We're not against quirks, their spokespeople would claim in interviews, voices dripping with false reasonability. We just think certain types need more oversight, more monitoring, for everyone's safety. After what happened in Mizudafu, can you really say we're wrong? Incidents began to pile up. A young woman with scales on her skin was harassed on a subway, called a monster, told to go back to whatever hole she crawled out of. A boy with an obviously mutated appearance was jumped behind his school. Storefronts in heteromorph-heavy neighborhoods found their windows shattered, slurs painted across their doors. It was irrational. It was cruel. XXX. Then the leak happened and everything got worse. No one ever discovered which emergency responder broke confidentiality. Perhaps it was guilt, perhaps it was rage, perhaps it was simply loose lips after too many drinks. But the information that spread through the city like wildfire was simple and devastating. The Mizudafu calamity was caused by a child. A nameless child. A child the government and hero agencies were protecting. What had been a slow boil erupted into an inferno. Riots broke out across the city. Storefronts were looted and burned. Mass protests clogged the streets, thousands upon thousands of voices unified in a single, furious demand. Justice, security, action against the monster that could explode again at any moment. Effigies were burned, featureless figures meant to represent the unknown child, painted with lurid flames. Chaos gripped Mizudafu for 3 terrible days. XXX. It was All Might who finally stepped in. Not with a raised fist. Not with the overwhelming force that had made him the symbol of peace. He appeared before the largest protest, a seething mass of humanity gathered outside the main government building, and he did something no one expected. He asked them to listen. "I know you are afraid," he said, his voice carrying across the crowd without. Amplification, that unmistakable baritone that had narrated 1,000 rescues. "I know you are angry. I know you are grieving. You have every right to be. What happened in Mizudafu? It was a tragedy beyond words. And I know that tragedy feels even worse because you don't have answers. Because you don't have anyone to blame." He paused, letting the words settle. The crowd had gone quiet. Not calm, but listening. Waiting. "But I'm asking you, Imbaginjia, to remember something. The person responsible for this disaster is a little boy. A 4-year-old child who didn't choose his quirk. Who didn't want any of this to happen. He lost his mother that day. He lost everything. And right now, he is alone, and he is terrified. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Not all of them sympathetic. I'm not asking you to forgive him. I'm not even asking you to understand. I'm asking you to have faith. In me, in the heroes who protect this nation, in the fundamental truth that every person has a right to life. Even the ones whose power frightens. Because if we abandon that principle, then we've already lost everything we claim to be fighting for. His eyes swept across the crowd, and there was no smile on his face. Only sincerity, raw and unguarded. I'm here. I will always be here as long as I live. And I swear to you on my life, on my honor, on everything I am, that I will keep you safe. Please. Trust me. Please. Let us find a better way than this. The speech went on, long and filled with fiery passion, every word chosen with the care of a man who understood that the wrong phrase could ignite the powder keg beneath him. By the end, many in the crowd were weeping. Others had lowered their signs, their fists, their voices. It was far from a miracle. All Might's words brought many back to their senses, but far from all. The hate groups didn't dissolve, if any. This over time they only grew. The fear didn't evaporate. The questions didn't go away. But it was enough. Enough that the riots subsided. Enough that a fragile, false peace could take hold. Enough that the city could begin the long, uncertain process of moving forward, even if things would never go back to how they were. Even if the cracks would never fully heal. All Might walked down the halls of UA High School, his footsteps echoing against polished floors that had seen generations of aspiring heroes pass through. The building was quiet today, caught in that strange limbo between semesters when most students were home and the faculty scattered to various obligations. Afternoon sunlight slanted through the tall windows, casting long golden rectangles across the corridor. He had been here countless times before. Guest lectures, charity events, the occasional consultation with Nizu on matters of national security and, of course, his own time as a student here. But today felt different. Today, his chest was tight with something he rarely allowed himself to feel. Dread. 3 months. It had been 3 months of phone calls that went nowhere, of bureaucrats who suddenly had scheduling conflicts, of doors closed politely but firmly in his face. He had used every contact he had, called in favors he had been saving for emergencies, and still the answer was always the same. The matter is being handled. Your involvement is not required at this time. Thank you for your concern. As if concern was all he had to offer. Toshinori stopped before a large red oak door, the brass nameplate beside it reading Principal Nezu in elegant script. He raised his fist to knock, already rehearsing what he would say, how he would make Nizu understand that Henideto see the boy, that he couldn't just. The door burst open. Toshinori barely had time to register movement before a figure came barreling out, pivoting mid-stride with reflexes that spoke of combat training. A woman, he realized as she narrowly avoided slamming directly into his chest. American, if her features and the faint accent he caught were any indication. She was dressed in civilian clothes, a simple blazer and slacks, but there was something about the way she carried herself that marked her as more than she appeared. Whoa! Sorry about that, big guy. She was already moving past him, one hand raised in apology, her eyes flicking to a watch on her wrist. Didn't see you there. I'd stopped to say hi properly, but my flight back to the States leaves in 2 hours and I still have to clear customs. Hero licenses only get you so much leeway, you know? It's no problem, Toshinori called to her retreating form, turning slightly to watch her go. She moved fast, heels clicking against the floor in a rhythm that suggested she was used to running. Take care of him, she shouted back over her shoulder, not breaking stride. He's a good kid. He deserves better than all this. Then she was around the corner and gone, leaving Toshinori standing in the hallway with more questions than he'd started with. Ah, Toshinori. It's good that you made it so quickly. Please come in. The voice came from inside the office, warm and welcoming in that particular way that always made Toshinori slightly uneasy. Nizu had a gift for sounding perfectly friendly while his mind worked through calculations that would give most supercomputers pause. Toshinori stepped through the doorway and into the principal's office. The room was exactly as he remembered it. walls lined with bookshelves that groaned under the weight of texts in a dozen languages. A massive mahogany desk that somehow managed to look both cluttered and meticulously organized. The faint smell of good tea and old paper. And behind the desk, perched on a chair specially designed to accommodate his small stature, sat Nizu himself. The principal of UA was difficult to describe. Mus? Bear? Dog? Some combination of all three that defied easy categorization? Whatever he was, his black eyes gleamed with an intelligence that went far beyond human, and his smile was the kind that could mean anything from genuine pleasure to carefully laid trap. Today, Toshinori noted, there were shadows under those eyes that hadn't been there before. Even Nizu, it seemed, was not immune to the weight of recent events. "Please, sit," Nizu said, gesturing to one of the chairs opposite his desk. A teacup already sat waiting, steam curling gently from its surface. "I took the liberty of preparing some tea. You look like you could use it." Toshinori lowered himself into the chair, which creaked slightly under his considerable bulk. He didn't reach for the tea. "Who was that?" he asked instead, nodding toward the door. Nizu tilted his head, taking a delicate sip from his own cup. "You've never met? Well, I suppose that's not too surprising. Your paths wouldn't have crossed often. That was Miss Memory, the US Ace number 32 hero, I believe, though rankings over there shift around quite a bit more than they do here." Nizu paused, watching Toshinori's face with those unreadable eyes. "She's been helping us with the boy for the past few weeks." Toshinori's brow furrowed. Miss Memory. The name tugged at something in the back of his mind. He had heard it before, in passing, during one of his stints working with American heroes years ago. A specialist of some kind. Someone they brought in for. The realization hit him like a freight train. "She's a psychic," he said slowly, the words coming out rough. "A memory specialist. They call her the country's top trauma counselor because of her quirk. She can go into people's heads and—" He trailed off, not wanting to finish the sentence. Not wanting to believe it. Nizu simply watched him, saying nothing. "Nizu." Toshinori's voice had dropped, all the warmth gone from it. "Tell me you didn't." "Didn't what, Toshinori?" Nizu asked, sounding all too innocent. "You know exactly what." Toshinori was gripping the armrests of the chair now, his knuckles going white. "Her quirk. It doesn't just let her view memories. She can alter them. Lock them." Still, Nizu said nothing. He simply took another sip of his tea, his expression mild. "And you?" Toshinori was on his feet, the chair scraping back against the floor. His fists trembled at his sides, not raised, but the tension in his massive frame made the threat implicit. "You had no right. That boy lost his mother in the disaster. Those memories are all he has left of her. And you just took them from him?" For a long moment, the only sound in the office was Toshinori's heavy breathing and the soft clink of Nizu setting his teacup down on its saucer. "No right." Nizu's voice was calm, contemplative, almost gentle. "I wonder about that. Perhaps you're correct, Toshinori. Perhaps I overstepped." He folded his paws in front of him, meeting the hero's furious gaze without flinching. "Or perhaps you still don't understand the scope of what we're dealing with here. Even after seeing the Calamity firsthand. Even after giving that speech to the protesters." "Don't lecture me about scope," Toshinori growled. "I was there, Nizu. I saw what happened. I saw the bodies. I smelled the—" He stopped. Swallowed hard. "I know what that boy's power can do," he continued, his voice quieter now but no less intense. "But that doesn't give anyone the right to reach into his head and steal his memories of his own mother. He's 4 years old. She's all he had." Nizu let out a long, slow sigh. It was a surprisingly human sound, coming from such an inhuman creature. "Toshinori," he said, "it's not like this was our first choice. Believe me when I say we exhausted every other option before making this decision. However—" He paused, his eyes drifting toward the window, toward something only he could see. "I can tell that words alone won't convince you. You've always been the type who needs to see things for himself." The principal hopped down from his chair, his small form barely reaching Tashinori's knee. He walked to the office door and opened it, looking back at the towering hero with an expression that might have been sympathy. I think it's time I showed you exactly what we're dealing with. Then you can judge for yourself whether we made the right call. He gestured toward the hallway. Well, come on. Tashinori stared at him for a moment, the anger still simmering in his chest but tempered now by something else. Uncertainty. And beneath that, a fear he didn't want to name. He followed Nizu out the door. The hallway stretched before them, long and silent. Tashinori's footsteps fell heavy against the floor while Nizu's made barely a sound, the small principal moving with a quick, efficient gait that belied his size. Neither spoke at first. The tension from the office lingered between them like a third presence. It was Nizu who broke the silence, his tone conversational, as if they were discussing the weather rather than the fate of a child. Tell me, Tashinori, do you even know why the boy is here at UA rather than in government custody? Or under the direct supervision of the Hero Public Safety Commission? Tashinori's jaw tightened. You know I don't. And it's not for lack of trying. Yes. Your persistence. Nizu's whiskers twitched in what might have been amusement. I've heard about your calls. Quite a lot of them, from what I understand. You've made yourself rather unpopular with several cabinet members. I don't care about being popular. I care about that boy. Tashinori ran a hand through his hair, frustration bleeding into the gesture. Every time I tried to get information, every time I asked to see him, I was shown the door. Or hung up on. Or told my involvement wasn't appropriate at this time. He let out a bitter laugh. I actually thought my nagging was why you finally called me. Oh no, that's not why I called. Nizu glanced up at him, those dark eyes giving nothing away. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. They reached the elevator. Nizu pressed the call button and stood, waiting, paws folded behind his back. The government's initial response was predictable, he began. Fear drives bureaucracies toward simple solutions. And the simplest solution, when faced with something terrifying and uncontrollable, is to make it disappear. To bury it somewhere deep and dark where no one has to think about it anymore. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. The doors slid open, revealing a sterile metal interior. Nizu stepped inside, and Tashinori followed, ducking slightly to avoid bumping his head on the frame. They threw him in Tartarus. Nizu continued as the doors closed. He pressed a button for one of the lower levels, one that Tashinori didn't recognize. The deepest cell they could find. Maximum security. The kind of place they put villains who can level city blocks with a thought. Tashinori felt his stomach turn. He's 4 years old. Yes, he is. Nizu's voice remained level, factual. They sedated him heavily, of course. Kept him unconscious as much as possible. The theory was that if he couldn't wake up, he couldn't lose control. The elevator began its descent. Tashinori watched the floor numbers tick down, each one feeling like a step further into something he wasn't prepared for. The theory was wrong, Nizu said. Tashinori looked down at him. What happened? The drags lost their hold. Only for about 3 seconds, mind you. The boy didn't even fully wake up. He simply stirred. Nizu paused, letting the word hang in the air. 3 seconds. That's all it took to completely annihilate one of the most secure sections of Tartarus prison. Reinforced walls designed to contain the strongest villains in the country. Vaporized. The elevator hummed softly around them. Tashinori found he had stopped breathing. After that incident, Nizu continued, the government tried several other approaches. Different sedatives. Quirk-suppressing technology. Isolation chambers designed for worst-case scenarios. Each attempt failed in its own spectacular way. Nothing they had could contain a power of this magnitude. Not for long. How long did this go on? 2 weeks. Nizu's tone was the same one might use to describe a mildly inconvenient delay. 2 weeks of failure after failure, of emergency protocols and near disasters. And then, finally, they swallowed their pride and called me. The elevator slowed. Stopped. But the doors didn't open. Nizu looked up at Tashinori, his expression unreadable. They were begging Tashinori. The most powerful government officials in Japan, the same ones who had refused to take your calls, were begging me for help. And I agreed. Under a single condition. Which was full custody. Complete authority over the boy's care and future decisions, as long as we don't have another disaster. A small smile crossed Nizu's face, though there was no humor in it. I told them that if they wanted Yue's help, they would have to trust Yue's judgment. No interference. No oversight committees. No bureaucrats looking over our shoulders and second-guessing every choice we make. Toshinori stared at him. They would never agree to that. He's far too dangerous. Too valuable. The government would never just hand over control of a power like his. You're absolutely right. They didn't agree immediately. Nizu pressed a button, and the elevator doors finally slid open, revealing another long corridor. This one was different from the halls above. The walls were reinforced steel, the lighting harsher, more clinical. It took some negotiation. A few additional conditions before they would sign off on the arrangement. They stepped out of the elevator, their footsteps echoing differently here, duller, absorbed by the heavy construction around them. What conditions? Toshinori asked, though part of him didn't want to know. Nizu walked a few paces ahead before answering, his voice carrying back over his shoulder. The first condition concerns his future. If the boy ever gains true control of his quirk, he must be made into a hero. Not a choice, not an option. A requirement. He glanced back at Toshinori. From the government's perspective, the logic is straightforward. A hero with that level of power could reshape Japan's standing on the world stage. International relations, military deterrence, disaster response, the applications are endless. They see him as an asset to be cultivated. Toshinori frowned. That's limiting. What if he doesn't want to be a hero? Then he doesn't get a choice. Nizu shrugged, a surprisingly casual gesture. I'm not saying I agree with it. But in truth, it's not the worst outcome. The boy already dreams of being a hero. It's all he talked about when he was conscious long enough to talk at all. So while the condition restricts his future, it restricts it towards something he already wants. I can live with that. They continued walking. The corridor seemed to stretch on forever, the reinforced walls pressing in around them. You said conditions. Plural. Toshinori's voice was quiet. What's the other one? Nizu stopped walking. For a moment, he didn't turn around. He simply stood there, his small form dwarfed by the massive hallway, his shadow stretching long beneath the harsh lights. The other condition, he said finally, concerns the possibility of failure. Failure. Now Nizu turned. His expression was calm, composed, but there was something in his eyes that Toshinori had rarely seen there. Something that looked almost like sorrow. If there is another full loss of control, Nizu said, each word measured and precise, we are authorized to treat him with lethal force. The words landed like physical blows. Toshinori felt them hit his chest, his stomach, somewhere deep in his core where the guilt already lived. We are to treat him with lethal force, Nizu repeated, as if Toshinori might not have understood the first time. Those are the exact words in the agreement. If the boy cannot be contained, if his power threatens to cause another calamity, we are to put him down. Like a rabid animal. Like a monster. Silence. The kind of silence that has weight, that presses down on everything it touches. You agreed to that? Toshinori's voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. Naturally I did. The response was so matter-of-fact, so devoid of the horror that Toshinori felt, that for a moment he couldn't process it. He stared at Nizu as if seeing him for the first time. Toshinori. Nizu's voice softened, though his gaze remained steady. I understand your reaction. Believe me, I do. But I need you to think clearly for a moment. The government already failed to contain him. Every resource they had, every expert, every technology, none of it was enough. We are the last people in Japan, perhaps the last people in the world, who have any real hope of helping this boy. If we fail too, what then? He took a step closer, looking up at the towering hero with an expression that demanded honesty. What happens to the civilians, Toshinori? The innocent people living in whatever city he happens to be in when the next loss of control occurs? How many of them do we sacrifice for one boy? Toshinori's fists clenched at his sides. He wanted to argue. Wanted to shout that there had to be another way, that they couldn't just agree to kill a child, that heroes were supposed to save people, not execute them. But the words wouldn't come. Because somewhere, beneath all the rage and grief and denial, he knew that Nizu was right. He hated it. He hated it more than he had ever hated anything in his life. But he knew. If the boy lost control again, thousands more could die. Tens of thousands. And no amount of heroic idealism would bring them back. I won't let it come to that. The words came out before Toshinori fully realized he was speaking them. His voice was raw, stripped of the confident boom that defined all might, leaving only Toshinori Yagi underneath. A man. Just a man. Nizu. I won't let it happen. I already failed him once. His hands were trembling now, fine shivers running through those massive fists. I was supposed to save people that day. I was supposed to be there, and I wasn't, and because of that, everything. He stopped. Drew a breath. Steadied himself. I can't do it again. I can't fail him again. Whatever it takes, whatever I have to do. I'll make sure it never comes to that. Nizu studied him for a long moment. The harsh corridor lights cast strange shadows across the principal's face, making his expression impossible to read. Then, slowly he nodded. I know you won't, he said quietly. That's why I called you here. He turned and resumed walking down the corridor. After a moment, Toshinori followed. They didn't speak again for some time. The weight of what had been said hung between them, too heavy for casual words to carry. But something had shifted in the silence. An understanding, perhaps. Or at least the beginning of one. The corridor stretched on, leading them deeper into the earth, closer to the boy whose power could end the world. They arrived at a small control panel set into the wall, its surface covered in buttons and suches that looked far more complex than anything in the upper floors of UA. Nizu stepped up onto a small platform beside it, bringing him to a comfortable operating height, and began entering a sequence of commands. I wanted you to see this first, he said, his paws moving with practiced efficiency across the controls. Before you meet the boy. Before you form any opinions about what we've done or failed to do. I think it's important that you understand exactly what we're working with. Somewhere deep within the walls, machinery groaned to life. Toshinori could feel vibrations through the floor, the movement of something massive and heavy. A large steel blast door began to grind open in front of them. The sound was immense, metal scraping against metal, the kind of industrial noise that belonged in shipyards or construction sites. Slowly, inch by inch, the door retreated into the wall, revealing a wide observation window. Toshinori stepped forward to look through it. For a long moment, he couldn't process what he was seeing. The room beyond the glass had been a containment chamber once. He could tell that much from the basic shape, the reinforced corners, the remnants of what might have been monitoring equipment along one wall. But now, the back wall had melted. Not cracked, not broken. Melted. The metal had run like candle wax, frozen mid-drip in formations that looked almost organic, almost alive. In some places it had pooled on the floor before hardening again. In others it had simply ceased to exist, leaving gaps that opened onto more reinforced walls behind, those too showing signs of extreme heat damage. The floor was worse. Whole sections were simply missing, as if something had punched through the metal plating and kept going. Through the gaps, Toshinori could see another level below, its surfaces scorched black. How deep did the damage go? 2 floors? 3? The ceiling had partially collapsed. Support beams hung at odd angles, their ends twisted and warped. Chunks of concrete and metal lay scattered across what remained of the floor, some of them fused together into unrecognizable shapes. It looked like the aftermath of a bomb, or a volcanic eruption, or something even worse, something that defied easy comparison. This was where we first kept the boy, Nizu said quietly. He had moved to stand beside Toshinori, his small form reflected in the observation glass. The chamber was constructed using the same materials and techniques employed in the city's fusion reactors. Walls capable of withstanding temperatures that would vaporize conventional steel. Shielding designed to contain the most extreme energy outputs we could imagine. He paused. We thought it would be more than enough. Toshinori couldn't look away from the destruction. His mind kept trying to calculate the forces necessary to cause this kind of damage and kept failing. The numbers were too big. Too impossible. At first, it was enough, Nizu continued. For the first time since the Calamity, we were able to safely talk with the boy. To learn about him. To begin understanding who he was beneath all that power. What? Toshinori's voice came out rough. He cleared his throat and tried again. What was he like? Nizu was silent for a moment, his reflection in the glass looking older somehow, wearier. Frightened, he said finally. Confused. He didn't understand where he was or why he couldn't go home. At first, he would only ask 2 questions, over and over again. Where is my mom? And when can I see her? Toshinori closed his eyes. He could picture it too easily. A small child, alone in a room like this, surrounded by strangers in white coats, asking for his mother. Not understanding why no one would give him a straight answer. We couldn't tell him the truth. Not then. He was too unstable and we didn't know yet how his emotions affected his power. Nizu's voice had dropped, almost to himself. So we deflected. Changed the subject. Told him she was resting, that he would see her soon. Small lies. Necessary lies. Or so we told ourselves. But eventually yes. Nizu nodded slowly. But that came later. First, once we got past the questions about his mother, we had a chance to actually talk with him. To learn who Izuku Midoriya really was. Izuku. Toshinori turned the name over in his mind. He had known it before, had seen it in the classified reports he'd managed to glimpse before being shut out, but hearing it spoken aloud made the boy feel more real somehow. More human. And who was he? Toshinori asked. A small smile crossed Nizu's face, tinged with something bittersweet. A 4-year-old boy with a deep love for heroes, he said. He could name every member of the top 10 from memory. He knew their quirks, their signature moves, their catchphrases. He had opinions about which hero agencies had the best costumes and which ones needed better theme songs. Despite everything, Toshinori felt something loosen in his chest. It was such a normal thing, such a childlike thing. Every kid in Japan grew up watching hero broadcasts, collecting trading cards, arguing about who would win in a fight between this hero and that one. Izuku Midoriya, for all his terrifying power, was still just a little boy. He told us he wanted to be a hero himself one day, Nizu continued. He was absolutely certain his quirk would come in eventually, and when it did, he was going to use it to save people and make them smile. Just like his favorites did. Did he know? Toshinori asked quietly. About what his quirk had done? No. And we didn't tell him. Nizu's expression darkened. At that point, he had no memory of the Calamity itself. The trauma had buried it somewhere deep. He knew something bad had happened, knew. That was why he was here, but the specifics were mercifully absent. We saw no reason to force him to confront them. Toshinori nodded slowly. That, at least, seemed like the right call. Which brings me to why I called you here, Toshinori. Nizu turned away from the window, looking up at the towering hero with an expression that was difficult to read. Do you know what the first thing Izuku asked for was? After the questions about his mother and going home, once he had calmed down enough to want anything else at all. Toshinori shook his head. How could I? He asked us if we could put on a video for him. Of all the things Toshinori had expected, that wasn't one of them. A video? It was a simple request. Easy to accommodate. We had screens in the chamber, originally intended for psychological monitoring, but perfectly capable of playing media. We told him we'd be happy to put something on for him and asked what movie he wanted to watch. Nizu paused, and that bittersweet smile returned, stronger now. It wasn't a movie at all. He asked us to put on your debut rescue. The one from 16 years ago, when you first appeared in Tokyo. Toshinori felt something tighten in his throat. I'm sure you remember it, Nizu continued. The apartment fire in Shibuya. 43 people trapped on the upper floors, the building structure failing, emergency services overwhelmed. And then, out of nowhere, a hero no one had ever seen before. A young man with blonde hair and a smile that seemed to light up the smoke itself. Toshinori remembered. Of course he remembered. It had been his first major rescue after receiving One for All, his introduction to the world as All Might. He had been so young then. So certain that his smile could fix anything. He asked for that video specifically, Nizu said. Not any of your recent work, not the fight against Toxic Chainsaw or the hostage situation in Osaka. Your debut. A piece of footage that's older than he is. How did he even know about it? His mother, apparently. She showed it to him when he was very young, and he became obsessed with it. He had watched it hundreds of times before the Calamity. Knew every moment by heart. Nizu turned back to the observation window, gazing at the devastated chamber beyond. We put it on for him. And Toshinori, that one video, that single piece of footage, kept him calm for days. Every time he started to get upset, every time his temperature began to rise and the alarm started going off, all we had to do was play your voice saying, "I am here," and he would settle. He would watch you burst through the smoke, watch you carry those people to safety, and his whole body would relax. Toshinori couldn't speak. The tightness in his throat had spread to his chest, making it hard to breathe. You are that boy's hero, Toshinori. Not in the abstract way that you're a hero to millions of children across Japan. To Izuku Midoriya, you are something more. Something personal. You're the voice that tells him everything will be okay. The face that makes him believe the world isn't as frightening as it seems. Nizu's voice softened, carrying a weight that belied his small frame. And that's why I called you. Because what happened to this room, it happened after we told him the truth. Toshinori's gaze snapped back to the melted walls, the missing floor, the collapsed ceiling. The destruction took on a new meaning now. A new horror. You told him about his mother. It wasn't a question. We couldn't keep lying to him. Nizu's head hung low, his eyes fixed on the ground. Every day he asked about her. Every day we made excuses. It was eating at him, the not knowing, and it was eating at us too. We thought, we hoped, that if we explained it gently, if we were there to support him through it, he might be able to handle it. The principal let out a breath that seemed to carry the weight of the world. We were wrong. Toshinori stared at the devastation. At the testament to a 4-year-old boy's grief, frozen in melted metal and shattered concrete. When we told him his mother was never coming back, Nizu said quietly, he screamed. Just once. And then silence fell between them. The kind of silence that follows tragedy, that fills the spaces where words are inadequate. After that, we had no choice but to sedate him again, Nizu continued. His power was completely out of control, feeding on his grief, growing stronger with every passing second. If we hadn't acted quickly, he might have burned through to the surface. Might have caused another calamity right here, in the heart of you. He looked up at Toshinori, and for the first time, the mask of calm composure cracked. Beneath it was exhaustion. Sorrow. The weight of impossible choices made in impossible circumstances. That's when I called Miss Memory. That's when we made the decision to lock away his memories of Inko Midoriya. He spread his paws in a gesture of helpless resignation. I'm not proud of it. I don't expect you to approve. But Toshinori, his quirk is too powerful. Far too powerful for a 4-year-old who just lost everything he loved. Until he's older, until he has more control, those memories are a trigger we simply cannot allow him to pull. Toshinori was silent for a long moment, his reflection staring back at him from the observation glass. Behind it, the ruined chamber stood as testament to a child's unimaginable pain. I understand, he said finally. The words tasted like ash in his mouth, but he meant them. It had to be done. For the safety of others. He turned to face Nizu directly. But still. He paused, searching for the right words. To take memories of his mother at that age. She's all he had. All he's ever going to have. And now even that's been taken from him. It's not as bad as you think, Nizu said gently. Miss Memory's quirk is more nuanced than simple erasure. The memories aren't completely gone. She muddied them, locked them away in a part of his mind he can't easily access. But they're still there. Over time, as he grows older and more stable, they'll begin to resurface on their own. He'll remember his mother. Just not clearly. Not the way he should. Toshinori wasn't sure if that made it better or worse. It was the best we could do, Nizu added quietly. The only option that let him live. Toshinori drew a deep breath, held it, let it out slowly. So what now? He asked. What can I possibly do for him that you haven't already tried? Nizu smiled. It was a small thing, tired but genuine. Just be there, he said. Talk to him. Let him know that his hero is here to help. That he's not alone. The smile faded slightly. He's awake now. Has been for a few days. We have him in a new containment chamber, one that's holding for the moment. But he's fragile. Withdrawn. He doesn't ask about his mother anymore, which is somehow worse than when he did. He barely speaks at all. The principal started walking again, gesturing for Toshinori to follow. I think seeing you might help. I think it might remind him that there's still something worth holding on to. Toshinori followed, his mind churning with everything he'd learned. The weight of it pressed down on him, heavier than any villain he'd ever faced. But beneath the weight, something else stirred. A spark of determination. A flicker of hope. If he was that boy's hero, then he would be that boy's hero. No matter what it took. They had made it halfway down the next corridor when the sound of hurried footsteps echoed from somewhere behind them. Toshinori turned to see a figure in a yellow construction suit rounding the corner at a near jog, one hand clutching a thick stack of papers while the other braced against the wall for balance. Power loader. Toshinori recognized him immediately. The excavation hero was one of UA's most valuable faculty members, responsible for maintaining the school's extensive underground facilities and training grounds. His helmet, shaped like a massive mechanical jaw, bobbed with each labred breath as he caught up to them. Principal? Nizu. Power loader breathed, bending over slightly to catch his breath. Glad I caught you. The new scanners, they're finally up and running. Nizu's ears perked forward with interest. And? We got a read. A good one this time. Power loader straightened, still breathing hard, and held out the stack of papers. Preliminary analysis of the boy's quirk factor. Took us 3 weeks to build sensors that could get close enough without melting, but we finally managed it. He seemed to notice Toshinori for the first time, his posture shifting slightly in recognition. Oh hey All Might. Don't see you around this part of the campus often. Power loader. Toshinori nodded in greeting. It's good to see you. Though I wish it were under better circumstances. Don't we all? The excavation hero let out a humorless laugh. I've been down here so much lately I'm starting to forget what sunlight looks like. Not that I'm complaining. The work is, well, it's something that's for sure. Nizu had already taken the papers and begun flipping through them, his dark eyes scanning the data with remarkable speed. His expression shifted as he read, cycling through something that looked almost like excitement before settling into grim fascination. You mentioned the sensors kept melting, Toshinori said, turning back to power loader. I know the boy's quirk involves heat, but surely standard fireproof equipment should be able to handle. He trailed off as power loader let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. Standard fireproof equipment, the hero repeated, shaking his head. All Might, no offense, but I don't think you understand what we're dealing with here. Standard fireproof materials max out at maybe 2000 degrees Celsius. Industrial grade, the stuff they use in steel foundries and rocket engines, can handle around 3000. He jabbed a finger toward the papers in Nizu's paws. That boy's body temperature, at its lowest point, while he's asleep, is approximately 4500 degrees Celsius. Toshinori blinked. The number didn't quite register at first. It was too large, too abstract. He tried to put it in context, reaching for comparisons. That's... He paused, calculating. That's hotter than the surface of the sun. Almost, power loader confirmed. The sun's surface sits around 5500. So he's not quite there yet? Lucky us. The sarcasm in his voice was thick enough to cut. And that's on a good day. When he's calm. When he's sleeping peacefully. When he's not upset or scared or having a nightmare. What happens when he's not calm? We don't have exact numbers. Our sensors can't survive long enough to get them. Power Loader crossed his arms, his mechanical helmet tilting slightly. But based on the damage we've seen, our best estimates put his upper range somewhere in the tens of thousands. Maybe higher. We genuinely don't know where the ceiling is, or if there even is one. Toshinori felt the floor shift beneath him, though he knew it hadn't actually moved. The scale of what they were describing was beginning to sink in, and it was far worse than he had imagined. Well, Nizu murmured, still reading through the papers. This is both absolutely terrifying and rather expected. He looked up, that unsettling gleam back in his eyes. It would seem we have quite the star on our hands. Toshinori stared at him in pure confusion. I'm sure if things work out he'll be quite the star in the hero world, Toshinori said carefully, still hoping he had misunderstood. But I have to ask, what exactly is his power? I know it involves fire and heat, but it seems like there's more to it than that. Nizu lowered the papers, fixing Toshinori with a look that was equal parts amusement and pity. All might, he said slowly, I was being quite literal. The boy's quirk is that of a star. As in, he pointed upward with one paw. That giant ball of fire in the sky. The words hung in the air between them. Toshinori's mind tried to process them, tried to fit them into some framework that made sense. A quirk based on stars. Not fire, not heat, not energy projection. Stars. That can't possibly be right, he said finally. What would a power like that even mean? It means, Power Loader cut in, his voice grim, that if the data is accurate, and I believe it is, then that kid can do anything a star can do. Precisely, Nizu agreed, his tone far too cheerful for the subject matter. Raw heat output on the level of a stellar body. Electromagnetic radiation across the entire spectrum. Light, radio waves, ultraviolet, X-rays, gamma rays. And if our models are correct. He paused, letting the moment build. Gravity manipulation. Gravity? Stars are massive objects, all might. Their gravitational pull is what holds solar systems together. What draws planets into orbit. What, in extreme cases, collapses matter into singularities. Nizu's eyes glittered. If young Izuku's quirk truly encompasses all aspects of stellar phenomena, then gravity manipulation falls well within his potential domain. Toshinori opened his mouth, then closed it again. He had faced villains with devastating powers before. Quirks that could level buildings, reshape terrain, manipulate the fundamental forces of nature. But that's terrifying, he said quietly. Power Loader let out a snort. All might, no offense, but you've never been known for your scientific knowledge. And I really don't think you grasp the full scope of how truly terrifying that is. Toshinori looked at him, waiting. What we've observed so far, the heat, the light, the damage, that's all consistent with a fairly average star. A yellow dwarf, like our own sun. Powerful is dangerous, absolutely. But within the realm of things we can theoretically prepare for. Power Loader's voice dropped, taking on a weight that hadn't been there before. But stars aren't all the same. They exist on a spectrum. And at the far end of that spectrum are things that make our sun look like a candle. He began ticking off points on his fingers. O-class stars. Blue supergiants. Surface temperatures over 30,000 degrees Celsius. Luminosity millions of times greater than the sun. If the boy can tap into that level of output. He shook his head. There's no material on Earth that could contain it. Nothing we could build would survive even indirect exposure. And that's not even the worst possibility, Nizu added, his cheerful tone wildly inappropriate for the content of his words. Stars don't just burn. They die. And when they die, they leave behind some very interesting remnants. Pulsars, Power Loader said. Magnetars. Neutron stars with magnetic fields strong enough to wipe electronic systems from thousands of kilometers away. Strong enough to rearrange the atomic structure of matter itself. Toshinori felt a chill run down his spine despite the warmth of the underground corridor. Or if we're particularly unlucky. Power Loader's voice trailed off, and he seemed reluctant to finish the thought. Black holes, Nizu completed for him, still smiling. The end state of the most massive stars. Gravity so intense that not even light can escape. If young Izuku's quirk could replicate that particular stellar phenomenon, well. He spread his paws in a gesture that somehow conveyed both helplessness and amusement. We're all dead. In so many creative and fascinating ways. The physics alone would be quite remarkable to observe, assuming any of us survived long enough to observe them, which we wouldn't. Silence fell over the corridor. Toshinori stared at the small principal, trying to reconcile the casual DISCLAIMER with the apocalyptic content. Beside him, Power Loader had gone quiet, lost in whatever calculations or nightmares were running through his mind. But Nizu continued, holding up one paw. At this point, all we can do is hope that doesn't happen. The boy's quirk factor seems stable at its current level. There's no indication he can access those more extreme manifestations. Not yet, anyway. Not yet, Toshinori repeated flatly. Quirks evolve over time. You know this as well as anyone. Nizu shrugged. For now, we focus on what's in front of us. A 4-year-old boy with the power of a star, who needs help learning to control it before he hurts himself or anyone else. He tucked the papers under one arm and looked up at Toshinori. All the theoretical disasters in the world don't change the fundamental task. We help him. We teach him. We give him a reason to keep that power contained. Power Loader cleared his throat. Well, I should get back to the lab. We're still running secondary analyses, and I want to triple-check these numbers before we finalize anything. He gave Toshinori a nod. Good seeing you, All Might. Try not to think too hard about the whole "this kid can end the world" thing. I'll try, Toshinori managed. You won't succeed, but it's worth a shot. Power Loader raised one hand in farewell and headed back the way he'd come, his footsteps echoing down the corridor until they faded into silence. Nizu watched him go, then turned back to Toshinori. Now then, I think we've lingered here long enough, don't you? The boy is waiting. And I suspect he could use some good news for once. He started walking again, and after a moment, Toshinori followed. His mind was still reeling from everything he'd just learned. The numbers, the implications, the casual discussion of extinction-level events. It was too much to process, too vast to hold in his head all at once. But beneath the fear and the confusion, one thought kept rising to the surface. That wasn't a monster they were describing. It was a child. A 4-year-old boy who loved heroes and wanted to save people and had lost his mother in the worst way imaginable. And right now, that child needed someone to believe in him. Toshinori walked faster, catching up to Nizu with renewed purpose. Whatever else Izuku Midoriya might become, whatever terrifying potential lurked within his small body, he was still just a boy. And boys needed heroes. That, at least, was something Toshinori knew how to be. Both walked in silence after that, each lost in their own contemplation of what they had just learned. The corridor stretched on, identical panels of reinforced steel passing by on either side, the harsh lighting casting everything in sharp relief. Toshinori found himself counting his footsteps just to have something to focus on, something to anchor him against the swirling chaos of his thoughts. Stars. Black holes. The potential end of everything, wrapped up in the body of a child. It was too much. And yet, somehow, it wasn't enough to make him turn back. Eventually, Nizu slowed his pace. Up ahead, the corridor widened into a small observation area, dominated by a broad window set into the wall. Unlike the blast door that had revealed the destroyed chamber, this window was already visible, already waiting for them. Toshinori's footsteps slowed as they approached. His heart, which had been steady throughout everything else, began to beat faster. This was it. After 3 months of phone calls and closed doors, after everything Nizu had told him, he was finally going to see the boy. Nizu stepped to the side, allowing Toshinori to approach the window first. Toshinori moved forward until he stood directly before the glass. And then he looked. The containment room beyond was smaller than he had expected. More intimate. The walls were the same reinforced steel as everywhere else, but someone had made an effort to soften the space. A few pieces of child-appropriate artwork had been affixed to one wall, their edges slightly curled from heat exposure. A small shelf held what looked like picture books, their spines warped but still legible. And in the center of the room, on a bed unlike anything Toshinori had ever seen, lay Izuku Midoriya. The bed was the first thing that truly registered. It wasn't a bed in any conventional sense. Instead of a mattress, there was a thick layer of some kind of gel, translucent and faintly luminescent, that rippled softly with the boy's every breath. The substance seemed almost alive, shifting and flowing to accommodate his small body, pulsing with a gentle rhythm that matched his heartbeat. It took us quite a while to find a suitable replacement for a normal bed, Nizu said quietly, coming to stand beside Toshinori. After we woke him up, he kept burning through everything we tried. Standard mattresses lasted seconds. Flame-resistant fabrics lasted minutes. Even materials rated for industrial furnaces eventually gave way. He gestured toward the gel. That substance is a prototype developed by Hatsum Industries. It's designed to absorb and redistribute extreme temperatures. So far, it's the only thing that's worked. Toshinori barely heard him. His attention was fixed on the boy. Izuku was small. So impossibly, heartbreakingly small. His body barely made a dent in the gel bed, his limbs curled up in the instinctive self-protection of a sleeping child. Green hair, dark as forest shadows, splayed across the pillow-shaped depression beneath his head. His face, what Toshinori could see of it, was round and soft with baby fat, dotted with freckles across the nose and cheeks. He looked like any other 4-year-old. He looked like he should be at home, in his own bed, with his mother checking on him before she went to sleep. In his small hands, clutched against his chest, was the corner of a blanket. But it wasn't a normal blanket. The material looked more like woven foil, metallic and reflective, designed to withstand temperatures that would incinerate cotton or wool. Even so, the edges showed signs of heat damage, small holes and scorch marks where his grip had been too tight during some forgotten nightmare. It was such a small thing. Such a human thing. A child holding onto his blanket for comfort in a place that was nothing like home. Toshinori's throat tightened. On the wall opposite the bed, a holoscreen flickered with soft light. The sound was muted, but Toshinori didn't need audio to recognize what was playing. He knew every frame of that footage by heart. Smoke and fire. A building on the verge of collapse. Screaming civilians trapped on the upper floors, emergency services overwhelmed, despair settling over the scene like a shroud. And then, bursting through the chaos like a force of nature, a young man with blonde hair and a smile that seemed to push back the darkness itself. Younger than Toshinori was now. Stronger in ways that had nothing to do with muscle. So certain, so absolutely certain, that everything would be okay. I am here. The words scrolled across the bottom of the screen in subtitles, the sound muted but the message unmistakable. On the footage, the young All Might began pulling people from the wreckage, his laughter booming even through the silence, his presence transforming tragedy into triumph. Toshinori watched his younger self save those people. Watched himself smile and wave and promise that everything would be fine. He had believed it then. With every fiber of his being, he had believed that his smile could save the world. That if he just tried hard enough, if he just was enough, no one would ever have to suffer. How naive he had been. The video loops automatically, Nizu said softly. He asked us to set it that way. So it would be playing whenever he woke up. Toshinori couldn't respond. Something was building in his chest, something too large to contain, pressing against his ribs and climbing up his throat. He pressed his hand against the glass. The surface was cool beneath his palm, a barrier between him and the sleeping child. But even through the reinforced material, he imagined he could feel warmth radiating from within. The impossible heat of a star, contained in a body no bigger than his forearm. "He's so small," Toshinori whispered. The words came out broken, barely audible. For the first time in years, the symbol of peace looked utterly human. Not a statue of courage carved from unbreakable stone. Not the pillar that held up society's faith in heroes. Just a man. A man hollowed out by guilt, standing before a child he had failed to save. The tears came without warning. They welled up from somewhere deep inside, from a place Toshinori had learned to lock away long ago. Heroes didn't cry. Heroes smiled and laughed and told everyone that everything would be fine. That was the role. That was the mask. That was what the world needed from him. But here, in this underground corridor, with no one watching but a mouse bear principal and a sleeping child who couldn't see him anyway, the mask cracked. The tears spilled over, tracing silent paths down his cheeks. They caught the harsh light of the corridor, glinting like liquid fire as they fell. And still Toshinori didn't look away from the boy. Couldn't look away. This was what he had failed to prevent. Not a statistic. Not a news headline. Not a theoretical disaster to be discussed in government meetings. This was a child. A real, living child who had lost everything because Toshinori hadn't been there when it mattered. "I am here, young man," he whispered, his voice trembling. The words that had once been a battle cry, a promise of salvation, now came out like a prayer. Like a plea for forgiveness. "And I will make things up to you." The glass fogged slightly beneath his palm, his breath coming faster as the emotions threatened to overwhelm him. He pressed harder against the window, as if he could somehow push through, somehow reach the boy, somehow undo all the damage that had been done. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then Izuku stirred. It was a small movement, barely perceptible. A shift of his shoulders, a slight turn of his head. His small fingers tightened on the metallic blanket, bunching the heat-resistant fabric in his grip. And beneath him, the gel bed pulsed. Light bloomed through the translucent substance, soft and warm, spreading outward from where the boy's body made contact. It wasn't alarming, wasn't the dangerous flare of power that had destroyed the other room. It was gentler than that. Almost peaceful. Like a star settling into its orbit. Like warmth seeking warmth. Toshinori held his breath. For a moment, just a moment, he could have sworn he saw the corner of Izuku's mouth twitch. Not quite a smile. But something close. Something that suggested, even in sleep, some part of the boy had hurt him. Then the moment passed. Izuku's breathing evened out, his small body relaxing back into the gel, the light fading to its usual gentle pulse. Just a sleeping child again. Just a boy with too much power and not enough years to understand it. Toshinori let out the breath he'd been holding. "Nizu," he said, and his voice was stronger now. Steadier. The tears were still wet on his face, but something had shifted in his expression. The grief was still there, but it was no longer alone. Alongside it, burning just as bright, was determination. "I've made up my mind." He turned away from the window, facing the principal with eyes that held no doubt. "I'm going to adopt him myself." "No." The word came immediately. Gentle but firm. Final in a way that left no room for negotiation. Toshinori stared at Nizu, the determination in his eyes flickering with confusion. "What?" "No," Nizu repeated. He hadn't moved from his spot beside the window, his small form barely reaching Toshinori's knee, but somehow he seemed to fill the corridor with his presence. "I understand why you want to do this, Toshinori. Truly I do. Your heart is in exactly the right place. But I cannot allow it." "Cannot allow it?" The confusion was curdling into something hotter now, mixing with the grief and guilt that still burned in Toshinori's chest. "Nizu, no one can keep him safer than I can. I'm the #1 hero. I have resources, connections, power that no one else in this country can match." "Yes," Nizu agreed calmly. "You do. You have all of those things. And that is precisely the problem." Toshinori's fists clenched at his sides. The tears were still drying on his face. "He already looks up to me. You said it yourself. I'm his hero. If anyone can give him hope, give him something to hold on to, it's me." "You can give him hope, yes. You can be his hero. You can visit him, talk to him, inspire him." Nizu's voice remained steady, patient, like a teacher guiding a student toward an answer they didn't want to find. "But, Toshinori, can you be his father?" The question landed like a physical blow. Toshinori opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. "Think about it," Nizu continued. "Really think. Not with your guilt, not with your longing to make things right, but with the practical reality of who you are and what your life demands. He began pacing slowly, his small paws clicking against the floor. You are the symbol of peace, the pillar upon which this entire society rests. Every day, you respond to disasters, fight villains, make public appearances, give interviews. You travel constantly. You sleep rarely. You have no fixed schedule, no guaranteed time off, no way to promise that you'll be home for dinner or there to tuck a child into bed. Each word was measured, precise, cutting through Toshinori's defenses with surgical accuracy. Can you honestly say you could give him a stable life? The kind of life a traumatized 4-year-old desperately needs. Nizu stopped pacing and looked up at him, those dark eyes filled with something that might have been sympathy. Can you be a father who is there when he needs one? Not sometimes. Not when your schedule allows. But consistently, reliably, every single day. Toshinori's jaw worked, but no words came. And what about the things you cannot provide at all? Nizu pressed on, gentler now but no less relentless. A mother's touch. A woman's presence in his life. Someone who can hold him when he cries, who can provide the kind of comfort that even the greatest hero cannot replicate through strength alone. Inko Midoriya is gone. That wound will never fully heal. But it will heal better with a maternal figure to help guide him through it. The fight was draining out of Toshinori's posture. His shoulders, which had been squared with determination moments ago, began to slump. I could. He started, but even he could hear how weak the words sounded. You could try, Nizu finished for him. And you would fail. Not because you don't care enough. Not because you wouldn't give everything you have. But because there are simply not enough hours in the day, not enough of you to go around. The symbol of peace belongs to everyone. A father needs to belong to his child. Silence stretched between them. Toshinori stared at the floor, his reflection barely visible in the polished surface. And there's another concern, Nizu added, his voice dropping lower. One that I suspect you haven't considered. Toshinori looked up. All for one. The name hung in the air like a curse. Toshinori felt his blood run cold. If that man learns of Izuku's existence, learns of his quirk. Nizu let the implication build before continuing. He will hunt him. You know this. A power like Izuku's would be the greatest prize All for One has ever sought. The ability to wield a star itself? To command the forces that fuel the universe? He would stop at nothing to claim it. Toshinori's hands were trembling again, but this time from a different kind of fear. And if Izuku were your son, Nizu continued, publicly known as the child of All Might, how long do you think it would take for that information to reach the wrong ears? How many villains would target him simply to hurt you? How many would see him as leverage, as a weakness to exploit? The trembling spread to Toshinori's shoulders. He wanted to argue, wanted to insist that he could protect the boy from anything, from anyone. But the words wouldn't come. Because deep down, in the part of himself he tried not to examine too closely, he knew Nizu was right. All for One had already taken so much from him. His mentor. Years of his life spent in a shadow war that seemed to never end. If that monster ever learned about Izuku, I understand, Toshinori whispered. The fire had gone out of his eyes, leaving only pain behind. A deep, aching pain that settled into his bones like cold water. Nizu nodded slowly, his expression softening. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear. And I know it hurts. But sometimes the best thing we can do for the people we care about is to step back and let someone else take the lead. Toshinori said nothing. He turned back to the window, looking at the sleeping child beyond the glass. So small. So vulnerable. So completely unaware of the forces that swirled around his tiny life. He couldn't be the boy's father. He understood that now. But it didn't make the wanting go away. Oh, Nizu said, his tone shifting to something lighter, and I should mention that someone else has already offered to take him in. Someone I believe would make a perfect fit. Toshinori's head snapped around, a new emotion cutting through the grief. His eyes widened with sudden, horrible suspicion. Please tell me you're not talking about Endeavor. For a moment, Nizu simply stared at him. Then, without warning, the principal burst out laughing. It was a strange sound, high-pitched and chittering, completely at odds with the heavy atmosphere that had dominated their conversation. Nizu actually doubled over, one paw pressed against his chest as the laughter continued. "Endeavor," he managed between gasps. "Oh, Tashinori, that's wonderful. I needed that." Tashinori blinked, thrown off balance by the sudden shift. "I don't see what's so funny. He has resources, he has experience raising children with powerful quirks, and he's made it very clear he wants to surpass me by any means necessary. Taking in a boy with this kind of power would be exactly the sort of thing he might." "Clearly," Nizu interrupted, still chuckling, "you haven't paid Endeavor a visit since he woke up." Tashinori frowned. He had heard that Endeavor had woken up, but he hadn't had time to check on his rival personally, too consumed with his own guilt and his futile attempts to reach Izuku. "What do you mean?" Nizu's laughter subsided, though the amusement remained in his eyes. "I can safely say that Endeavor wants absolutely nothing to do with young Izuku. Nothing at all." "Why not?" "Because," Nizu said, a hint of dark satisfaction creeping into his voice, "Endeavor is not accustomed to being humbled. He has spent his entire career as the number 2 hero, always reaching for the top spot, always convinced that his flames make him invincible. And then, the principal gestured toward the window, toward the sleeping child. A 4-year-old boy, on the day his quirk first manifested, generated more heat than Endeavor has produced in his entire lifetime. The number 2 hero responded to that disaster with everything he had and accomplished nothing. Less than nothing. His flames didn't even register against that kind of power." Nizu's smile took on a sharper edge. Endeavor didn't just fail to stop the calamity. He was hospitalized for weeks with burns covering 40% of his body. Burns? Tashinori. The flame hero, burned by someone else's fire. "I'm told the psychological damage may take even longer to heal than the physical." Tashinori absorbed this in silence. He had never liked Endeavor, had always been uncomfortable with the man's obsessive drive and ruthless methods. But he couldn't find it in himself to take pleasure in another hero's suffering. Not even Endeavor's. "So no," Nizu concluded, "even if Endeavor wanted custody of the boy, which he emphatically does not, I would never allow it in a million years. That man has enough trouble raising the children he already has. He doesn't need another one to damage." "Then who?" Tashinori asked. "Who else could possibly handle a child like this?" Nizu's expression shifted again, the sharpness fading into something warmer. Something almost hopeful. "Are you familiar with Hatsum Industries?" The name sparked recognition. Of course Tashinori knew Hatsum Industries. Everyone in the hero world did. They were Japan's leading developer of support gear and hero equipment, responsible for innovations that had saved countless lives. "The support gear company," Tashinori said slowly. "What do they have to do with this?" "Not the company," Nizu corrected. "The family. Specifically, the CEO. Akari Hatsum." Nizu began walking again, away from the observation window, gesturing for Tashinori to follow. "Akari is a remarkable man. Brilliant, innovative, driven by a genuine longing to help people rather than simple profit. He built his company from nothing, revolutionized the support gear industry, and has remained humble throughout it all. But more importantly than any of that," Nizu glanced back over his shoulder, "he loves his family more than his own life. His wife, his daughter. They are his entire world. Everything he does, every innovation he creates, is ultimately in service of making their lives better." "And he wants to adopt Izuku?" Tashinori asked, struggling to keep up both physically and mentally. "He reached out to us within a week of the calamity. Before we even had the boy stabilized, before we understood the full scope of his power, Akari Hatsum was already offering help." Nizu's voice carried a note of genuine admiration. He saw a child in need and responded. Not with fear, not with calculation, but with compassion. They continued down the corridor as Nizu spoke, moving away from the observation area towards some destination Tashinori couldn't guess. Since then he has reallocated his company's entire research and development department to finding ways to help Izuku live a normal life. Heat-resistant materials, quirk suppression technology, environmental containment systems. His people are working around the clock. He has also taken over the full funding of the boy's current stay here at UA, which I can assure you is not an insignificant expense. Toshinori let this sink in. A man he had never met, with no apparent connection to Izuku Midoriya, had devoted his company's resources and his personal fortune to helping a child he had never even spoken to. Why? Toshinori asked. Why would he do all of that for a stranger? Nizu stopped walking and turned to face him fully. Because it was the right thing to do. Because Akari Hatsum is the kind of person who sees a problem and cannot rest until he's found a solution. And because... A small smile crossed the principal's face. He has a young daughter. She's around Izuku's age. Him and his wife desperately wanted to have another child for her to grow up with. But sadly Mei's BRH was not a clean one and her mother lost the ability to have another. Toshinori shook his head. Something shifted in Toshinori's chest. The pain was still there, the guilt and the longing and the grief. But alongside it, for the first time since this conversation began, he felt something else. From what I have heard, she is her father's daughter. Curious, determined, absolutely convinced that there's no problem too big to solve if you just think hard enough. Nizu's smile widened. I believe she would make an excellent sister for Izuku. Someone his own age to grow up with. Someone who could see him not as a monster or a weapon or a disaster waiting to happen, but simply as family. Toshinori was quiet for a long moment, processing everything he had heard. It sounded almost too good to be true. A loving family with unlimited resources, a father devoted to helping Izuku, and a sister to be. But he did have one concern. I've heard of the Hatsum family, he said slowly. Their reputation in the industry is sterling. But... He hesitated, unsure how to phrase it diplomatically. Aren't they all a bit crazy? Nizu burst out laughing again, though this time it was shorter, more contained. Crazy? He shook his head, still chuckling. I prefer the word eccentric. Akari has been known to work for 72 hours straight when he's close to a breakthrough. His wife is one of the most feared lawyers in Japan. And young Mei has already started taking apart household appliances to see how they work, much to her parents' mixed pride and despair. The principal's expression softened into something genuine, something warm. But, Toshinori, I cannot think of anything better for a boy who needs to heal. The Hatsum household is chaotic, yes, unpredictable, filled with explosions and failed experiments and the constant hum of innovation. But it is also filled with love. Unconditional, unwavering, slightly manic love. He looked up at the towering hero, meeting his eyes directly. Izuku Midoriya has spent 3 months in containment rooms and hospital beds, surrounded by scientists and government officials who see him as a problem to be solved. What he needs now is a family who will see him as a son, as a brother, as a person worth loving, power and all. Nizu turned and began walking again. The Hatsums can give him that. I truly believe it. Toshinori stood motionless for a moment, watching the small principal's retreating form. Then slowly he followed. He still wished he could be the one to raise Izuku. That longing hadn't faded. But for the first time, he could see past it to something larger. Something more important than his own guilt or his own need for redemption. What mattered was the boy. What mattered was giving Izuku the best possible chance at a happy life. And maybe, just maybe, the Hatsum family could provide that,